The moment Colonel Grant Whitfield pressed delete on Sergeant Emily Carter's warning, he knew exactly what was about to happen, and he let it happen anyway. Somewhere on a mountainside in Arizona, a decorated general was walking straight into a kill zone that a $2 billion AI system had just labeled safe. Whitfield didn't flinch. He didn't call anyone. He watched the screen, and he waited. Before we go any further, hit subscribe and stay with me until the very end. And drop a comment below with the city you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far this story travels. Emily Carter walked through the gates of the forward operating base with a rifle slung over her shoulder that most of the men on that base had only ever seen in a museum. It was a bolt action, older than half the soldiers standing around watching her, its wood stock scratched and worn smooth by hands that had held it through places nobody talked about anymore. She didn't look at the stairs. She didn't need to. 29 years old, 5 years in uniform, and she had long ago stopped expecting anyone to understand why she still trusted a piece of steel and wood over a screen. "Is that a joke?" a young private muttered to his buddy, not quietly enough. "They're pairing us with someone using an antique?" Emily kept walking. She'd heard worse. She'd heard it in training. She'd heard it in her last deployment, and she'd hear it again before the sun went down today. What she hadn't expected was to hear it from the man who was supposed to be leading this operation. Captain Michael Reynolds met her outside the command tent, arms crossed, jaw tight. He didn't offer a handshake. "Sergeant Carter," he said, like he was testing the name out loud to see if it sounded as unlikely as it looked on paper. "I read your file. Impressive numbers. Old methods." "Old methods still put bullets where they need to go, sir," Emily said. "We don't operate like that anymore." Reynolds gestured toward the row of surveillance monitors behind him, each one glowing with drone feeds, thermal overlays, predictive threat mapping. "Everything you're looking at was designed to make guesswork obsolete. We don't need a set of eyes and a hunch. We need data." "With respect, sir, data doesn't have instincts." "Instincts get people killed, Sergeant." Emily held his gaze. "So does trusting a machine that's never stood on a hillside in the rain, waiting to see if a shadow moves." Reynolds didn't answer that. He just turned and walked into the tent, leaving her standing there in the open, surrounded by young soldiers who were already placing bets on how long she'd last. Inside, the briefing began less than an hour later. General William Harrison sat at the head of the table, 62 years old, silver at his temples, the kind of quiet authority in his posture that came from decades of making decisions that got people killed or kept them alive. He'd flown in that morning for a security assessment of the region, a routine visit that had been planned for months. Nothing about it should have been dangerous. A young intelligence officer stood at the front of the room and pulled up the tactical map. Red zones, yellow zones, green zones marked safe. The AI system, a program the officer proudly referred to as Sentinel, had swept the entire route the general would take that afternoon and returned a clean bill of health. "No threats detected," the officer said. "Sentinel's confidence rating on this route is 98.6%. That's about as close to certain as we get." Emily stared at the map. Something in her chest tightened, the kind of feeling she'd learned a long time ago never to ignore. She leaned forward. "That ridge," she said, pointing to a cluster of rocks along the eastern slope. "Why is that marked green?" The officer glanced at it. "Sentinel scanned it 3 times in the last 6 hours. Nothing there." "That's exactly what bothers me," Emily said. A few soft laughs rippled around the table. Reynolds didn't laugh, but he didn't hide his irritation either. "Care to explain that, Sergeant?" "That terrain," Emily said, "is the single best overwatch position on the entire route. If I wanted to take a shot at someone walking that road, that's exactly where I'd set up. And it's not empty because there's nothing there. It's empty because whoever's there knows how to stay invisible to a machine that's only looking for heat signatures and movement patterns it's been trained to recognize." "Sentinel accounts for camouflage," the officer said, a little defensively now. "Sentinel accounts for what it's been taught to expect," Emily said. "A trained sniper doesn't move like a threat. He doesn't breathe like a threat. He becomes part of the ground until the exact second he needs to stop being part of the ground. No algorithm on Earth has hunted the way a hunter has been hunted." Silence settled over the room. General Harrison, who had said nothing through the entire exchange, finally looked up. His eyes moved from the map to Emily, and back to the map. "How many confirmed kills, Sergeant?" 41, sir." "How many of them were flagged by a system like Sentinel before you took the shot?" Emily didn't blink. "None, sir. Every one of them. I found myself." The general's jaw shifted, the smallest motion, but Reynolds caught it and didn't like where it was going. "Sir, with respect, we can't delay the assessment based on a feeling," Reynolds said. "Sentinel has a 98% accuracy rate across 400 missions. We don't second-guess it because someone doesn't like how a screen looks." "I'm not asking you to cancel the mission," Emily said. "I'm asking for one more pass over that ridge. Human eyes, 15 minutes. Reynolds looked at the general, waiting for him to shut it down. Instead, Harrison studied Emily for a long moment, the kind of look that made most soldiers stand a little straighter. 15 minutes, Harrison said. "Humor her." Reynolds' face tightened, but he didn't argue with a two-star general. "Yes, sir." It should have ended there. It should have been simple. A drone redirected, a scan completed, a box checked. But somewhere between the briefing room and the operations desk, something changed. 15 minutes became 5. 5 minutes became a rushed, half-hearted pass that the intelligence officer later swore covered the whole ridge, though Emily would have sworn otherwise if anyone had asked her at the time. Nobody asked her. The mission clock was already running, and command didn't like delays, not even ones ordered by a general. By the time Emily reached her position on the opposite slope, laying prone behind a scarred outcrop of rock with her rifle set and her breathing already slowing into the rhythm she'd trained her whole body to find, the convoy was moving. She watched through her scope as the vehicles wound along the access road below, dust kicking up behind them, and she watched the ridge, that ridge, the entire time. Nothing moved. For a long time, nothing moved at all. "Overwatch, this is Command, radio check," came Reynolds' voice through her earpiece, flat and businesslike. "Overwatch reads you 5 by 5, Emily answered. "Convoy is 15 minutes from primary checkpoint. Sentinel confirms route is clear." "Copy," Emily said, though something in her stomach refused to settle. She kept scanning. Rock, brush, shadow, rock, brush, shadow. Her eyes moved in patterns she'd used 1,000 times before, patient, methodical, refusing to let boredom or false confidence dull her focus. And then, at the 11-minute mark, she saw it. A flicker. Barely anything. A shift in shadow that didn't belong to wind or animal, a change so small that any drone algorithm would have logged it as noise and moved on. But Emily's whole body went cold with recognition, because she knew exactly what she was looking at. Someone shifting weight after holding still too long. Someone adjusting a weapon. "Command, Overwatch, I have a possible hostile on the eastern ridge, grid 417, Emily said, her voice tight and urgent now. "Repeat, possible hostile on the ridge, Sentinel cleared." There was a pause. Too long a pause. "Overwatch, say again, Sentinel shows that grid is clear," Reynolds answered. "I don't care what Sentinel shows," Emily snapped. "I have a visual on movement consistent with a shooter in a firing position. Request permission to engage." "Negative, Overwatch. You do not have a confirmed target. We cannot authorize live fire on unconfirmed movement." "Sir, I am telling you there is a man on that ridge with a weapon aimed at this convoy." "I hear you, Sergeant, but I need confirmation. Drone is rerouting to your grid now." Emily's finger hovered near the trigger guard, every instinct in her body screaming that there was no time for a drone, no time for a reroute, no time for anything except the shot she wasn't allowed to take. She watched the convoy through her scope, watched it grow closer to the exact stretch of road that ridge overlooked, and she felt the seconds slipping through her hands like water. "Command, I am requesting authorization one more time," she said, forcing her voice to stay level, even as her pulse hammered in her ears. "If I'm right, we have less than 60 seconds before that convoy is exposed. Hold your position, Overwatch. Do not fire without confirmation. That's a direct order." Emily's jaw clenched so hard it ached. She had spent 5 years learning exactly when to trust the voice in her chest that told her a threat was real, and every one of those years was screaming at her now. But an order was an order, and she had learned the hard way once before what happened to soldiers who ignored one. The convoy reached the base of the ridge. "Come on," Emily whispered to herself. Scope trained on the shadow that refused to move again, refused to give her the confirmation everyone above her demanded. Move, give me something. And then, General Harrison's vehicle slowed to navigate a narrow bend in the road, exactly where the ridge gave the clearest possible line of sight, exactly where Emily had said it would. The first shot cracked across the valley like the sky splitting open. "Contact! Contact! Shots fired!" someone screamed over the radio, and the calm, controlled voices that had spent the last 20 minutes dismissing Emily's warning dissolved into chaos. Through her scope, Emily saw General Harrison stagger, clutching his shoulder, blood already darkening his uniform as soldiers scrambled to pull him behind the vehicle. Screaming. Return fire aimed at nothing, because nobody down there could see the shooter. Men shouting contradictory orders into radios that had gone from routine chatter to a wall of panicked noise. "Drone feed is down!" The intelligence officer shouted somewhere in the command tent, his voice cracking. "Sentinels lost the ridge. I don't know why. It's not responding. Overwatch, do you have eyes on the shooter?" Reynolds' voice came through, stripped of every ounce of the confidence he'd carried that morning. Emily didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. Her scope had already found him. The same shadow, no longer holding still, shifting into position for a second shot, a shot aimed at the men trying to drag a wounded general to cover. 412 meters. Crosswind pulling from the west. A target barely visible even now, mostly concealed behind rock, exposing no more than a sliver of shoulder and the edge of a weapon. No system on Earth would have called that a confirmed target. "Command, I have him," Emily said, and her voice had gone as still and cold as the barrel beneath her hands. "I am taking the shot." "Overwatch, hold, we still don't have She didn't hear the rest of it. She had already stopped listening. Every year of training, every lesson her instructors had beaten into her about patience and discipline and waiting for the perfect window collapsed down into one single truth she had known since the moment she saw that shadow shift on a ridge. A machine had called empty. If she waited one more second for permission, men were going to die, and no algorithm in the world was going to answer for it. Her breath slowed. The world narrowed to a single point of light at the end of a 400-meter tunnel. She exhaled. She fired. The round crossed the valley in less than a second, cutting through crosswind and distance, and every reason it shouldn't have found its mark, and the shooter on the ridge dropped before his second shot ever left the barrel. For a moment, the entire valley went silent. "Target down," Emily said into the radio, her voice shaking now that it no longer had to hold steady for anyone else. "Target down, second threat neutralized." Chaos erupted below in an entirely different key this time. Not panic, but disbelief, relief crashing through soldiers who had been certain for one endless stretch of seconds that they were about to lose their general on a road an AI system had promised was safe. Medics swarmed Harrison. Someone was shouting for a medevac. Someone else was simply standing in the open, staring up at the ridge where the second shooter had fallen, trying to understand how anyone had made that shot. Back in the command tent, Reynolds stood frozen in front of the monitors, staring at a drone feed that had only just come back online, now showing exactly what Emily had described from the very beginning. A second position, a second shooter, exactly where she said he'd be, exactly where Sentinel had sworn there was nothing. "That's not possible," the intelligence officer whispered, more to himself than anyone else. Sentinel confirmed that grid clear 3 times. Reynolds said nothing. He was still staring at the screen, at the small, dark shape of a fallen man on a ridge that had been marked safe. And for the first time since Emily Carter had walked through the gates of that base, he didn't have a single word of doubt left in him. General Harrison survived. The bullet had struck high in his shoulder, missing anything vital by a margin the surgeons later called miraculous, though Emily privately suspected it had less to do with miracles and more to do with the shooter never getting the clean second shot he needed. She learned later, standing outside the medical tent, long after the chaos had settled into exhausted quiet, that the entire convoy had come within a breath of losing not just their general, but half the security detail around him if that second round had ever left the barrel. Soldiers who had laughed at her rifle that morning didn't meet her eyes that evening. The same young private who'd called her weapon an antique now stood a little apart from the others, staring at her like he was trying to reconcile the woman in front of him with the joke he'd made 12 hours earlier. Reynolds found her sitting alone outside her tent as the sun dropped low over the ridgeline, that same rifle resting across her knees, cleaning it with the same slow, careful attention she gave everything. "You disobeyed a direct order," he said. "Yes, sir." "You could be facing serious consequences for that." "I know, sir." He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had lost the sharp edge it carried that morning. "You saved his life. You saved a lot of lives today." Emily didn't look up from the rifle in her hands. Then it was worth whatever comes next. Reynolds studied her, and something behind his eyes had shifted, some certainty he'd carried for years quietly cracking under the weight of what he'd just watched happen. "How did you know?" "Not the instinct. I understand instinct. How did you know that ridge would be the one, out of every position on that entire route?" Emily finally looked up at him, and for just a moment, something older and heavier moved behind her eyes, something that had nothing to do with sniper training or years on a battlefield. "Because I've seen this before, Captain. A system swearing a position is clear when every instinct in your body says otherwise. I've seen exactly what happens when people trust the screen over the soldier standing in the field." Reynolds frowned. "What do you mean you've seen this before?" Emily didn't answer that. She looked back down at her rifle, running the cloth along the barrel one more time, and for a moment Reynolds thought she simply wasn't going to respond at all. "It's a long story, sir," she finally said, "and I don't think either of us has slept enough to hear it properly tonight." He let it go, though the question clearly hadn't left him. He turned to walk away, then stopped, glancing back at her one more time. "For what it's worth, Sergeant, I was wrong about you." "You wouldn't be the first person to learn that the hard way, sir." Reynolds allowed himself the smallest, most reluctant smile before disappearing back toward the command tent, leaving Emily alone with the last light fading over the mountains, and a feeling she couldn't quite shake, no matter how hard she tried to convince herself the danger had passed. Because a hero's welcome, she'd learned once before, a long time ago, in a life she rarely spoke about, was sometimes only the beginning of the danger, not the end of it. People who exposed the gaps in systems that powerful men had built their careers on rarely got to walk away clean. And somewhere, in an office far from that mountain base, a man who had once watched a similar warning get deleted from a very different system was already reading a report about a sergeant who had disobeyed orders, ignored an AI with a 98% confidence rating, and saved a general's life with a rifle that had been decommissioned before some of the soldiers on that base were even born. He read her name twice. Then he picked up a phone and made a call that no one on that mountain would ever know about. And somewhere far away, in a base Emily hadn't even known existed yet, a decision was quietly made that her survival that afternoon had not been part of anyone's plan at all. That night, long after the base had gone quiet and most of the soldiers had finally allowed themselves to sleep, Emily lay awake staring at the canvas ceiling of her tent, her rifle propped within arm's reach the way it always was, an old habit she'd never bothered to break. Her mind kept circling back to the ridge Sentinel had called clear 3 separate times, to the 15 minutes that had somehow shrunk down to 5, to the strange, sick feeling that had settled in her chest the moment she first saw that map marked green. It wasn't the first time she'd seen data that was too clean to be trusted. It wasn't the first time she'd watched a system fail exactly where it mattered most. And as she finally drifted toward an uneasy sleep, she couldn't shake the growing certainty that somewhere behind today's ambush was something far bigger than one hidden shooter on one quiet ridge, something that had been waiting patiently for a very long time and had very nearly gotten exactly what it wanted. By the time the sun came up over the base, word of what happened on that ridge had already spread through every tent and hallway, twisted a dozen different ways by a dozen different mouths, until the story barely resembled what Emily had actually lived through the day before. Some said she'd disobeyed 3 direct orders. Some said she'd nearly gotten the general killed with a reckless shot that could just as easily have missed. Nobody, it seemed, wanted to simply say the truth, that a woman with an old rifle had seen something a $2 billion system couldn't, and it had saved a 2-star general's life. Emily didn't sleep more than 2 hours that night. She lay staring at the canvas above her, replaying the exact moment the shadow on the ridge had shifted, wondering how close it had come to not mattering at all. When the summons arrived just after 6 in the morning, delivered by a nervous young corporal who wouldn't meet her eyes, she wasn't surprised. "Colonel wants you in the command tent, Sergeant," the corporal said. "Now." "Which colonel?" The corporal hesitated, like the question itself made him uncomfortable. "Colonel Whitfield, ma'am, flew in an hour ago." Emily felt something cold move through her chest at the name, though she couldn't have said why. She'd never met the man. She only knew, the way soldiers always know these things, that when someone flew in that fast after an incident like yesterday's, it usually wasn't to hand out medals. She found Reynolds waiting outside the tent, arms crossed, his expression unreadable in a way that told her more than words could have. "What's this about?" she asked. "Review board," Reynolds said quietly. "They're calling it a preliminary inquiry into the engagement. Whitfield's running it personally." "That's unusual, isn't it? A colonel flying out for a field-level review?" "Very," Reynolds said, and for the first time since she'd met him, she heard something close to worry in his voice. "Be careful in there, Sergeant. Answer exactly what they ask, nothing more. You think I did something wrong?" "I think you saved the general's life," Reynolds said, "and I think that's not the only thing anyone in that tent is going to want to talk about." Inside, the tent had been rearranged since the briefing the day before, a long table set up with 3 officers behind it, Colonel Grant Whitfield seated at the center. He was a tall man, silver-templed, with the kind of composed, patient stillness that made junior officers nervous before he even opened his mouth. He looked at Emily for a long moment before speaking, and there was something in his gaze that felt less like scrutiny and more like calculation, like he was weighing exactly how much of a problem she was going to be. "Sergeant Carter," he said, "please sit." Emily sat. She kept her spine straight, her hands folded, the same posture she'd learned to hold through 100 debriefs before this one. "I've read the incident report," Whitfield said, sliding a folder across the table without opening it. "Quite a story. An unconfirmed threat, a direct order to hold fire, and a shot that by all accounts shouldn't have been possible at that range, under those conditions, on a target Sentinel never flagged. With respect, sir, the target was there. I saw him." "I don't doubt what you saw, Sergeant. I'm more interested in what you didn't do, which was follow a direct order from your commanding officer." Emily kept her voice level, though her pulse had begun to climb. "If I had followed that order, sir, General Harrison would very likely be dead right now, so would several members of his detail." "That's a convenient way to frame insubordination," Whitfield said, not unkindly, almost gently, which somehow made it worse. "But the fact remains. You fired on a target without authorization, based entirely on personal judgment, in direct contradiction of both your captain's order and a 98% confidence assessment from a system this entire division has spent 3 years and considerable funding validating. Then maybe it's time someone looked hard at why that system was wrong," Emily said. The room went very quiet. One of the other officers shifted in his seat. Whitfield's expression didn't change at all. "Careful, Sergeant," he said softly. "That system has an operational record most human analysts would kill for. It didn't fail yesterday. If anything failed yesterday, it was a communications breakdown between field assets and the AI's targeting network. A processing gap. Nothing more." "A processing gap," Emily repeated, "that conveniently opened up exactly on the one piece of terrain with a clear line of sight to the general's route. Coincidences happen in war, Sergeant. With respect, sir, I don't believe that one was a coincidence." Whitfield studied her for a long moment, and something behind his composed expression flickered, so brief Emily might have imagined it, if she hadn't spent 5 years learning to read exactly that kind of flicker in men who didn't want to be read. Then it was gone, replaced by the same measured calm. "I'll note your concerns for the record," he said. "For now, the review will conclude that your actions, while outside the bounds of standing orders, produced a favorable outcome under extraordinary circumstances. No disciplinary action will be taken." It should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like a door quietly closing somewhere she couldn't see. "Thank you, sir," Emily said, because there was nothing else to say. "One more thing, Sergeant. Whitfield's tone shifted, almost casual now, though his eyes stayed sharp. The recording equipment mounted at your overwatch position. The scope camera, the audio log. I understand it malfunctioned during the engagement. Emily blinked. Malfunctioned, sir? That's what the equipment officer reported this morning. Total data loss, corrupted files, unrecoverable. Whitfield said it as simply as if he were reading off a supply manifest. Unfortunate. It would have been useful corroborating evidence. Emily felt the floor shift slightly beneath her, though nothing in the tent had physically moved. Her scope camera had been running the entire time. She'd checked it herself before taking position, the way she checked every piece of equipment before every mission, out of habit as much as discipline. That equipment was fully operational when I set up yesterday morning, sir, she said carefully. I tested it myself. Equipment fails, Whitfield said, standing, signaling the end of the meeting before she could push further. Especially equipment that old. Dismissed, Sergeant. Good work out there yesterday. She walked out of that tent with her heart hammering in a way it hadn't during the entire ambush. Because a man on a battlefield with a rifle was a threat she knew exactly how to answer. This, a quiet room, a folder unopened, a piece of evidence that had simply ceased to exist overnight, was something else entirely, and every instinct she had was screaming that it was far more dangerous. By mid-morning, Emily had tracked down Corporal Ray Daniels, the young technician who'd been responsible for the equipment checks the day before the mission. She found him near the motor pool, and the second he saw her walking toward him, something in his posture changed. A flinch, quickly buried, that told her everything before he said a single word. "Sergeant Carter," he said, too formal, too fast. "Corporal, I need to ask you about my scope camera." "I already gave my statement to the equipment officer, ma'am." "I'm not asking for your statement. I'm asking you what actually happened." Daniels glanced past her, toward the command tent, then back at her, and lowered his voice almost to a whisper. "Ma'am, I really can't. You checked that unit yourself before I went out yesterday morning. You signed off on it. Was it working?" A long silence stretched between them. When Daniels finally spoke, his voice had dropped so low Emily had to lean in to catch it. "It was working perfectly, ma'am. Full charge, clean lens, recording buffer at capacity. I know because I ran diagnostics myself twice, because they told me to be thorough on this one." He swallowed hard. "Somebody accessed the storage drive last night, after the mission. I saw the access log this morning before anyone told me to stop looking at it." Emily's pulse spiked. "Who?" "I don't know, ma'am. The entry was there and then it wasn't. Somebody wiped the access log too." He looked genuinely frightened now, glancing over his shoulder again. "Ma'am, I need this conversation to not have happened. I've got 18 months left on my contract and a kid on the way." "Ray." Emily kept her voice as gentle as she could manage, though everything in her wanted to shake the truth loose faster. Someone destroyed evidence that would have proven a hostile combatant was on that ridge exactly where I said he'd be. That's not a paperwork problem. That's someone covering for the fact that the system failed, or worse, that someone made it fail. Daniels's jaw tightened. For a moment, she thought he might actually tell her more. Instead, he shook his head, took a step back. "I'm sorry, Sergeant, I really am, but I can't be the one who says that out loud." He walked away before she could stop him, and Emily stood there a long moment, the ground beneath her certainty growing shakier with every passing hour. She found the note that night, folded once and slipped under the flap of her tent sometime while she'd been at chow. No envelope, no name, just 4 words in block capital letters, written in a hand that had clearly tried to disguise itself. "You shouldn't have fired." Emily read it 3 times before the meaning fully settled in her chest, cold and heavy. Not "you shouldn't have disobeyed orders," not "you got lucky," "you shouldn't have fired," as if the problem wasn't that she'd broken protocol, but that she'd stopped something from happening that was supposed to happen. She didn't sleep at all that night. She sat with her back against her cot, rifle within reach, replaying every second of the last 24 hours, searching for the thread that connected a suspiciously narrow reconnaissance window, a ridge marked safe 3 separate times, a scope camera that had somehow failed only after it mattered, and now this, A warning slipped under her door by someone who clearly had access to the base, someone who knew exactly where her tent was. By dawn, she'd made a decision. She wasn't going to wait for answers to come to her. She was going to go find them herself, starting with the one place command couldn't quietly bury a paper trail, outside the chain of command altogether. 2 days later, a black SUV rolled through the base gates carrying a woman Emily had never met, but had heard plenty about within hours of her arrival. Special Agent Sarah Mitchell, 36 years old, Army Criminal Investigation Division, sent from Washington on direct orders that nobody on base seemed eager to explain. They flew in an actual CID agent for a review that's already closed? One of the junior officers muttered near the mess hall, loud enough for half the tent to hear. Something's not right about that. Emily thought the exact same thing, though for very different reasons than the men speculating around her. She sought Mitchell out that same afternoon, catching her just outside the makeshift office command had assigned her, a folding table and 2 chairs inside a supply tent that clearly hadn't been used for anything important in months. "Sergeant Carter," Mitchell said before Emily could introduce herself, not looking up from the files spread across the table. "I was hoping you'd find me before I had to find you." "You know who I am. I know exactly who you are." Mitchell finally looked up, and her eyes were sharp in a way that reminded Emily uncomfortably of Whitfield's, though something in her expression felt entirely different. Less calculation, more genuine hunger for the truth. "I've read the incident report 6 times. I've read the review board's conclusion, and I've read the equipment officer's note about a camera that apparently died at the exact moment it would have mattered most. You want to guess what I think about that?" "I say, Mom." "I think we might think the same thing," Emily said carefully. "Sit down, Sergeant." Mitchell gestured at the empty chair across from her. "Let's find out." For the next hour, Emily told her everything. The recon window that shrank from 15 minutes to 5, the ridge marked clear 3 separate times, the shooter who confirmed everything her instincts had screamed, the camera that had worked perfectly right up until it mysteriously didn't, the note under her tent flap, and Corporal Daniel's terrified confession about an access log that had appeared and then vanished overnight. Mitchell listened without interrupting once, her pen moving steadily across a legal pad, and when Emily finally finished, she sat back and exhaled slowly. "You understand what you're describing isn't a technical malfunction," Mitchell said. "You're describing a deliberate, coordinated effort to create a blind spot in the security net around a 2-star general and then erase every piece of evidence that would prove it happened on purpose." "I know how it sounds." "It sounds," Mitchell said, "exactly like something I was sent here to find. I just didn't expect to find it this fast." Emily leaned forward. "What do you mean sent here to find?" Mitchell hesitated, weighing something, then reached into her bag and pulled out a slim folder, sliding it across the table. 2 weeks ago, before any of this happened, before General Harrison's assessment was even finalized on the calendar, my office received an anonymous flag about irregular activity tied to the AI targeting contracts funding Sentinel's deployment. Budget anomalies, unusual data access patterns, a whistleblower complaint that got buried so fast most people in my building never even knew it existed. Emily opened the folder. Inside were printouts, procurement records, authorization codes, a chain of approvals that all led eventually to a name that had been redacted with thick black bars. "Who is this?" Emily asked, tapping the blacked-out name. "That," Mitchell said, "is what I flew out here to find out. Whoever it is has enough authority to override standard procurement review, enough access to alter mission routing without triggering a flag, and apparently enough reach to make a piece of field equipment disappear the night after it recorded something inconvenient." She paused. "Sergeant, I think what happened on that ridge wasn't a mistake anyone made. I think it was a test." The word landed heavier than Emily expected. "A test of what?" "Of whether Sentinel's failure would go unnoticed," Mitchell said. "Or maybe a test of whether the general would survive it. Either way, someone with a lot of money riding on that AI program needed to know exactly how it would perform under real conditions, and they needed a scenario clean enough to bury if it went wrong." Emily felt something twist cold and sick in her stomach. "You're saying someone deliberately created a gap in that system's coverage on a route carrying a general just to see what would happen?" "I'm saying it's the only explanation that fits every piece of evidence you just handed me," Mitchell said. "And I'm saying if I'm right, the person responsible didn't expect anyone to survive that ridge with a story to tell. They definitely didn't expect a sniper with an obsolete rifle to see what $100 million drone network missed." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Outside the tent, the ordinary noise of the base carried on, engines and boots and distant radio chatter, entirely indifferent to the conversation happening inside. "There's something else," Emily said finally, her voice quieter now. "Something I haven't told anyone here." Mitchell's eyes sharpened. "Go on." 2 years ago, I was part of a unit most people have never heard of. Task Force Meridian, small, classified, built around exactly the kind of work I do, reading terrain, reading people, catching what technology misses. We were pulled into an internal review of procurement contracts inside a weapons modernization program. We found irregularities, numbers that didn't add up, contracts awarded to companies that didn't exist a year before they won them. Emily's jaw tightened. Within 2 months, the unit was dissolved, officially for budget reasons. My clearance was downgraded overnight. Every file connected to what we found was sealed. "And unofficially?" Mitchell asked, though something in her voice suggested she already suspected the answer. "Unofficially, a friend of mine, Master Sergeant Daniel Cole, the man who taught me almost everything I know about this job, died in what they called a training accident 3 weeks after the unit was shut down. A live fire exercise gone wrong. Except Daniel Cole had run live fire exercises for 15 years without a single incident, and the report on his death never made sense to anyone who actually knew him." Emily's voice had gone flat, controlled, the way it always did when she pushed down something that threatened to become too large to carry. "I told myself for 2 years that it was exactly what they said it was, a tragedy, bad luck. And now? Now I'm sitting across from a CID agent telling me someone deliberately created a blind spot to test an AI weapon system on a 2-star general," Emily said. "And I'm thinking about a program that got shut down the second it got too close to something somebody didn't want found." Mitchell was quiet for a long moment, studying the redacted folder between them, then studying Emily with an entirely new kind of focus. "Sergeant, I need you to understand something. If there's a connection between what happened to your old unit and what almost happened to General Harrison 2 days ago, we are not looking at a procurement scandal anymore. We're looking at something that's been running, patiently for years, with people willing to kill to protect it." "I'm aware," Emily said quietly. "Are you sure you want to keep pulling this thread?" Mitchell asked. And for the first time, there was something almost like concern beneath the professional distance in her voice. "Because whoever's on the other end of it already tried to erase you once, 2 years ago, by taking away everything you'd built. If they realize you're looking again, they already know," Emily said. "I got a note under my tent flap 2 nights ago telling me I shouldn't have pulled the trigger. Whoever's behind this already knows exactly who I am." Mitchell absorbed that in silence, then closed the folder with a decisive motion, as if she'd just made up her mind about something. "Then we don't have the luxury of being slow about this." Over the following 3 days, Emily and Mitchell worked in careful, deliberate secrecy, meeting only when the base's routine gave them cover, speaking in a code of ordinary conversation that would mean nothing to anyone listening. What they found, piece by piece, painted a picture darker than either of them had expected. The mission route for General Harrison's assessment had been altered 48 hours before deployment. A change buried inside a routine logistics update that no one had flagged, adjusting the convoy's path to run directly beneath the ridge that Sentinel would later mark clear 3 separate times. Somebody rerouted the entire convoy through the one stretch of terrain with the worst blind spot in the whole valley, Mitchell said, spreading a printed map across the table late one night, her voice tight with barely restrained anger. And they did it quietly enough that nobody downstream even questioned it. "Who has authorization to alter a general security route?" Emily asked. "Very few people," Mitchell said, which is exactly the problem. She tapped a name on the authorization chain, still partially redacted, the black bar thinner than before, as if someone somewhere had started to feel the pressure of an investigation closing in and hadn't quite finished covering their tracks. Whoever approved this change has clearance high enough to sit near the top of the security apparatus for this entire region. That's not a mid-level officer covering a mistake, Sergeant. That's someone protected. Then came the second discovery, worse than the first. Buried inside Sentinel's operational logs Mitchell had pulled using authority. Emily suspected, she wasn't technically supposed to use yet, was a single override command, time-stamped less than 6 hours before the convoy departed, instructing the system to lock the eastern ridge grid as verified safe and suppress further automated rescans of that position for the remainder of the operation. It wasn't a processing gap, Mitchell said, staring at the log entry like it might change if she looked at it long enough. Someone told the system in plain language to stop looking at that ridge, deliberately, hours before anyone pulled a trigger. Emily felt the floor tilt again, the same sick vertigo she'd felt in Whitfield's tent 2 days earlier. That's not a bug, that's premeditation. That's attempted murder with a $2 billion cover story, Mitchell said grimly. The override command carried an authorization code, a string of letters and numbers that meant nothing to Emily, but made Mitchell go very still when she finally traced it back through 3 layers of encrypted routing. This code, Mitchell said slowly, belongs to a program authorization tier that officially stopped existing 2 years ago. Emily's chest tightened. How officially? Mitchell looked up at her, and something in her expression told Emily the answer before she said it out loud. It's tied to the same procurement division that funded Task Force Meridian, Mitchell said quietly. Sergeant, I think whoever shut your unit down 2 years ago never actually stopped operating. I think they just went somewhere nobody was looking anymore. For a long moment, Emily couldn't speak. 2 years of quietly telling herself that Daniel Cole's death had been exactly what the report said it was, that her unit's dissolution had been budgetary and nothing more, cracked apart all at once, replaced by a cold, sharpening certainty that had been circling the edges of her mind since the moment she first saw that ridge marked green on a map that had no business calling it safe. I need to see everything you have on that program, Emily said, her voice steady even as something furious and grieving moved beneath it. Everything. I don't care what clearance it requires. It requires clearance neither of us currently has, Mitchell said, which means if we go looking, we do it somewhere nobody can trace the request back to this base. Before Emily could answer, the tent flap snapped open behind them, and Corporal Daniels stumbled through it, pale, breathing hard, one hand pressed against a darkening bruise along his jaw. Ray! Emily was on her feet instantly. What happened? Somebody jumped me behind the motor pool, Daniels said, his voice shaking. 2 guys. I never saw their faces. They had me on the ground before I even... They said... He swallowed hard, glancing at the tent flap like he expected someone to be standing there listening. They said if I talked to you again, ma'am, they wouldn't stop at a warning next time. Mitchell was already moving, pulling Daniels toward a chair, checking the bruise with quick, practiced hands. Did you get a look at anything? Insignia? Accent? Anything? No, ma'am. It happened too fast. Daniels looked up at Emily, fear and something like guilt tangled together in his expression. I'm sorry, Sergeant. I can't do this anymore. I've got a family. You don't have to do anything else, Emily said, kneeling in front of him, keeping her voice steady, even though her pulse was hammering with fury. She didn't dare show him. You've already told us enough. Go to medical. Get that looked at, and don't talk to anyone about this conversation. Not command, not your buddies, no one. Daniels nodded shakily and let Mitchell walk him out toward the medical tent, leaving Emily alone with the map spread across the table, the redacted authorization code glowing faintly on Mitchell's laptop screen, and a certainty settling into her bones that felt heavier than anything she'd carried in 2 years. Whoever was behind this wasn't operating from some distant office in Washington, making decisions from a comfortable distance. They were here, on this base, close enough to know exactly where Emily's tent was, close enough to intercept a scared young corporal within hours of him talking to her, close enough to reach into a supply tent conversation that should have been invisible to anyone outside it. When Mitchell returned 20 minutes later, her expression had hardened into something Emily hadn't seen from her yet. Not fear, but resolve sharpened into a blade. "They're getting nervous," Mitchell said, "which means we're closer than they'd like." "Or it means they're about to do something worse than send a warning," Emily said. Mitchell met her eyes, and for a long moment neither of them said anything. The weight of that possibility settling over the tent like a held breath. "There's a research and logistics annex about 40 miles from here," Mitchell said finally, breaking the silence. "Old records, physical archives, things too sensitive to trust to any network Sentinel's people might have access to. If Task Force Meridian's files still exist anywhere, that's where they'd be." "Then that's where we go," Emily said. "Sergeant, listen to me." Mitchell's voice dropped, serious in a way that made Emily go still. "If we do this, we're not just reopening an old case. We're pulling a thread that already got one of your friends killed and got you erased from a program you didn't even know still mattered. Whoever's protecting this doesn't play by rules either of us can rely on for protection." Emily thought of Daniel Cole, of the live fire report that never made sense, of 2 years spent telling herself a lie because the truth had been too dangerous to chase. She thought of a young corporal's bruised jaw and shaking hands, of a note slipped under her tent flap by someone who wanted her too frightened to keep looking. "I already lost someone to whatever this is," Emily said quietly. "I'm not losing anyone else because I was too afraid to finish what he started." Mitchell held her gaze for a long moment, then gave a single firm nod, closing her laptop with quiet finality. "Then we leave at first light," she said. "And Sergeant, from here on, we assume every conversation we have on this base is being heard by someone who doesn't want us to find what we're looking for." Outside the tent, the base had gone quiet under a moonless sky. The kind of stillness that felt less like peace and more like something holding its breath. Emily stepped out into the dark, scanning the shadows out of a habit 2 years of training had carved into her bones, and for the first time since the ridge, she let herself fully acknowledge the thought that had been circling at the edge of her mind since she'd read 4 words on a scrap of paper 2 nights earlier. Whoever had buried Task Force Meridian, whoever had ordered a live fire exercise that killed a man who never made mistakes, whoever had quietly rerouted a general's convoy beneath a ridge marked safe by a system they'd taught to lie, that person wasn't finished. Yesterday's ambush hadn't been the end of a plan. It had only been the first piece of one still unfolding, and somewhere close enough to reach a scared corporal within hours, someone was watching Emily Carter far more carefully than she had ever imagined. The road out of the base was still dark when Emily climbed into the passenger seat of Mitchell's unmarked sedan, the sky barely beginning to lighten at the edges, the kind of gray that hadn't decided yet whether it belonged to night or morning. Neither of them spoke as Mitchell eased the car past the checkpoint, flashing credentials at a young guard who barely glanced at them before waving the vehicle through. It was almost too easy, and Emily hated how much that unsettled her more than if they'd been stopped. "You'd think leaving would be harder," she said quietly, once the gate had disappeared behind them in the mirror. "Don't relax yet," Mitchell said, eyes fixed on the road. "Easy exits make me more nervous than hard ones." They hadn't gone 3 miles before Emily's phone buzzed against her thigh, an unlisted number lighting the screen in the dark. She hesitated only a second before answering. "Carter, it's Reynolds." His voice was low, clipped, the sound of a man speaking somewhere he didn't want to be overheard. "Where are you?" "Why does that matter, Captain?" "Because Whitfield's been asking about you for the last 20 minutes, and he's not asking like a man who forgot to sign off on your leave request." A pause, tight with something that sounded almost like fear. "He knows you left the base with Agent Mitchell. He wants to know where you're headed." Emily's stomach dropped, but she kept her voice level. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I didn't know," Reynolds said, which was true 20 minutes ago. "Emily, listen to me. Whatever this is, whatever you two are chasing, Whitfield isn't just annoyed about it. He made a phone call right after he asked about you, and he closed the tent flap so nobody could hear it. In 4 years, I've never seen him do that. Did you hear anything?" "Just 3 words before I walked away, because staying any longer would have looked exactly like what I was doing." Reynolds exhaled hard. He said, "She's moving now." The words landed like ice water down Emily's spine. She glanced at Mitchell, who had clearly heard enough of the call to understand, her knuckles tightening slightly on the wheel. "Thank you, Michael," Emily said, and meant it more than the formality of his rank usually allowed her to show. "Watch yourself back there. You too." A beat. "Whatever you're about to walk into, I hope it's worth what it's already cost you." The line went dead. Emily lowered the phone slowly, staring out at the road, unspooling gray and empty ahead of them. "He's watching us," she said. "Whitfield already knows we left." "Then we assume he knows exactly where we're going to," Mitchell said, her jaw tight, "which means we don't take the direct route." She pulled the wheel hard at the next junction, taking them off the main highway onto a narrower two-lane road that wound through empty scrubland, and Emily felt the tension in the car ratchet up another degree, the kind of quiet that wasn't peace so much as two people straining to hear a threat before it arrived. For nearly 20 minutes, nothing happened. Then Emily caught it in the side mirror, a dark sedan, maybe half a mile back, matching their speed a little too precisely for a coincidence. "Sarah, I see it." Mitchell's eyes flicked to the rear view. "Been with us since the junction." "You think it's them?" "I think in about 2 minutes we're going to find out." Mitchell's voice had gone flat and focused, the sound of someone running through options faster than she was speaking them aloud. "Hold on." She took the next turn without signaling, cutting hard onto a service road that ran alongside a dry irrigation canal, gravel spraying beneath the tires. Emily twisted to watch behind them, her pulse climbing as the sedan slowed at the junction, hesitating just long enough to confirm every fear sitting in her chest, before it too turned and followed. "They're still on us." "Then we stop being subtle." Mitchell's foot came down harder, the car surging forward along the narrow road, dust rising in a cloud behind them. "There's a maintenance turnoff about a mile ahead, cuts back toward the highway through a culvert. If they don't know this route, we lose them there." "And if they do know it?" Mitchell didn't answer that, which was answer enough. The sedan behind them closed the distance with unhurried, deliberate confidence, and Emily's hand drifted instinctively toward the sidearm at her hip, every instinct she'd carried through 5 years of combat screaming that whoever was driving that car wasn't worried about losing them, because they didn't need to catch up. They just needed to keep them in sight long enough for someone else to close the trap. "Sarah, they're not trying to run us off the road," Emily said slowly, watching the sedan hold its distance with unnerving precision. "They're hurting us." Mitchell's eyes flicked to the road ahead, to the narrow maintenance turnoff approaching fast, and something in her expression shifted from focused to alarmed. "Toward the culvert. Don't take it. If I don't take it, we're stuck on this road with nowhere left to turn for another 6 miles. Sarah, if they wanted us dead, they'd have already tried something on an open stretch like this one." Emily's mind raced, piecing together the geometry of it, the way the sedan had let them see it just enough, just early enough, to make the turnoff feel like an escape instead of exactly what it was. "That turn is where they want us. Don't take it." Mitchell's hands tightened on the wheel, and for one endless second, Emily thought she was going to take it anyway, the momentum of the plan already carrying them forward. Then, at the very last moment, Mitchell yanked the wheel the other direction, back toward the open road, tires screaming against gravel as the car fishtailed and straightened. The sedan behind them surged forward immediately, no longer bothering with distance, and Emily twisted around in her seat in time to see a second vehicle emerge from a dirt access road ahead of them, angling to block the highway just past the curve, exactly where the culvert route would have spit them out. "Told you," Emily breathed, adrenaline sharp and cold in her chest. "Hold on," Mitchell said again, and this time her voice had an edge of something close to fear beneath the control. She cut the wheel hard right, off the paved road entirely, the car bouncing violently across open scrubland, dust exploding around them as the undercarriage scraped against brush and stone. Behind them, the first sedan tried to follow and immediately lost speed, its low frame unsuited for the terrain, while the second car reversed hard, attempting to cut an intercept angle across open ground that clearly wasn't built for it either. "They picked the wrong vehicles to box us in with," Mitchell said through gritted teeth, wrestling the wheel as the car crashed back onto a service track half a mile later, putting distance between them and both pursuing vehicles with every second that passed. Emily kept her eyes locked on the mirror, watching the two sedans shrink smaller and smaller until the terrain finally swallowed them from view entirely. "You think we lost them?" she asked, though she already knew better than to fully believe it. "For now," Mitchell said, "which means we've got maybe an hour before whoever's coordinating this figures out where else we might be headed." She glanced at Emily, something grim and resolute settling into her expression. "We need to move faster than that." They reached the research annex 40 minutes later, a low, unremarkable building set apart from any obvious military installation, deliberately anonymous in the way only the most sensitive facilities ever bothered to be. Mitchell parked around the back, out of sight from the main access road, and for a moment, they simply sat in silence, both of them scanning the empty lot for any sign they'd been followed after all. "Let me do the talking," Mitchell said finally. "My credentials will get us through the front door. What happens after that depends entirely on whether the man behind that desk decides to be difficult." He decided to be difficult. The archivist, an older civilian contractor named Walter Briggs, who looked like he'd spent 30 years perfecting the art of telling people no, studied Mitchell's identification for a long, deliberate moment before sliding it back across the counter. "CID clearance gets you into the building, Agent Mitchell," he said. "It doesn't get you into sealed program archives. That requires a specific unlock authorization, and frankly, I haven't seen one crossing my desk in longer than I care to admit." "I don't need the whole archive, Mr. Briggs," Mitchell said, keeping her voice patient despite the tightness Emily could see building behind her eyes. "I need one file. Task Force Meridian, disbanded roughly 2 years ago." Something flickered across Briggs's face at the name, brief, almost imperceptible, but Emily had spent 5 years learning to read exactly that kind of flicker, and it told her more than anything Briggs was willing to say out loud. "That designation doesn't exist in my system," he said, too quickly, too flatly. "With respect, sir," Emily said, stepping forward, "I served in that unit. I know it existed. I need to know what happened to it." Briggs's eyes moved to her for the first time, lingering a moment longer than they had on Mitchell's credentials, something almost sympathetic buried beneath the professional wall he'd built around himself. "Sergeant, I've worked in this building for 11 years. I've seen programs get shelved, reorganized, folded into other designations more times than I can count. Some of them, the files just get harder to find. Not gone. Harder to find. There's a difference, and it's usually not an accident which one applies." "Then help us find it the hard way," Emily said quietly. "Please." Briggs studied her for a long moment, glancing once toward the security camera mounted in the corner of the room, then back at her, and something in his expression settled into a decision. "I'm going to step away from this desk for exactly 11 minutes, he said, his voice suddenly clipped and formal, loud enough to carry to whatever might be listening. "Bathroom break. I trust you two will wait here quietly." He walked away without another word, disappearing down a side hallway, and Mitchell was already moving before the door had fully closed behind him, circling the counter to the terminal he'd left logged in. "That's not a bathroom break," Emily said, following her. "No," Mitchell agreed, fingers already flying across the keyboard. "That's a man who just decided which side of history he wants to be standing on." It took nearly 9 of Briggs's promised 11 minutes to find it, buried 3 folder layers deep under a designation that bore no obvious connection to Task Force Meridian at all. A program simply labeled Archive Transfer 114-C, its contents flagged for review that had apparently never happened. Mitchell pulled the files onto a portable drive with quick, practiced efficiency, and Emily leaned over her shoulder, scanning headers and dates, her chest tightening with every new document that scrolled past. Then she saw it, and everything in her went very still. "Sarah, stop. Go back." Mitchell scrolled back up, and there it was. A memo, dated just over 2 years earlier, its header stamped with a classification level Emily had never personally held clearance to see, titled simply, Project Prometheus, Autonomous Lethal Authority Initiative, Phase 2 Field Validation. "What is this?" Emily whispered, though some cold, sinking part of her already suspected. Mitchell opened it, and both of them read in silence, the words landing heavier with every line. The memo outlined in dry clinical language a proposal to accelerate full autonomous engagement authority for AI-driven targeting systems by demonstrating, through controlled field conditions, the operational failure risk inherent in human authorization chains during time-sensitive combat scenarios. It cited response time studies. It cited budget projections in the billions, tied to a defense contractor whose name Emily recognized from procurement documents Mitchell had shown her days earlier. And near the bottom, under a section labeled Validation Methodology, was a single sentence that made Emily's blood run cold. A controlled failure event involving a high-value asset, conducted under realistic field conditions with appropriate containment protocols, would provide the most compelling evidence for accelerated authority transfer. "They wanted the general to almost die," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper, disbelief and rage tangling together in her chest. "They wanted the delay, the authorization chain, the humans in the loop. They wanted all of it to fail publicly enough that nobody could argue against giving Sentinel full authority to make lethal decisions without a person ever signing off. And a general who's been publicly skeptical of full AI autonomy," Mitchell said slowly, pulling up a second document, a personnel note attached to Harrison's file, "would be the perfect proof of concept. Nearly losing someone who's testified against this exact program in front of an oversight committee twice in the last 18 months. That's not a coincidence, Emily. That's a target selected on purpose." Emily's hands had curled into fists at her sides, the memo's clinical, bloodless language somehow worse than if it had simply admitted what it meant in plain words. They didn't care if he lived or died, they just needed the failure to look real enough. And they definitely didn't account for a sniper with an obsolete rifle proving the exact opposite of what they needed to prove, Mitchell said grimly. "You didn't just save Harrison's life on that ridge, Sergeant. You blew a hole straight through a program worth billions of dollars, and every person with a stake in it now has a very personal reason to make sure this memo never sees daylight." Emily stared at the screen, at the redacted authorization signature at the bottom of the page, a black bar thinner now than the one she'd seen in Mitchell's earlier files, as if 2 years of careful protection had finally begun to erode under the weight of everything closing in around it. "Can you unredact it?" Mitchell's fingers moved across the keyboard, running the file through something Emily didn't fully understand, some layer of metadata beneath the visible document. For a long, tense moment, nothing happened. Then the black bar dissolved, and a name resolved beneath it in clean, unmistakable print. Colonel Grant T. Whitfield. Emily felt something settle into place in her chest, cold and absolute, the last piece of doubt she'd been quietly holding on to, finally collapsing under the weight of proof. The man who had sat across from her 2 days ago, calmly explaining away a scope camera that had simply malfunctioned, was the same man who had authorized a plan to let a general nearly die in order to protect a weapons contract. "He's the one," she said quietly. "He's been the one this whole time." "He's one of them," Mitchell corrected, already scrolling further, searching for more names, more signatures, more threads to pull. "A man with this much exposure doesn't operate alone. Somebody above him signed off on the funding. Somebody beside him made sure Sentinel's code could be quietly overridden without leaving a trace. We found one name, Sergeant. There's more buried in here, and we don't have much time to find them before—" The lights in the archive flickered once, then died entirely, plunging the room into sudden, disorienting darkness. "That's not a power outage," Mitchell said instantly, her voice dropping into a tight, controlled whisper, the sound of someone whose training had taken over completely. "Emily, weapon." Emily's sidearm was already in her hand before Mitchell finished the sentence, her back finding the edge of the counter, every sense straining against the darkness. Somewhere down the hallway, a door opened with the soft, deliberate care of someone who didn't want to be heard, and heavy footsteps began moving through the building with unhurried, methodical purpose. "Briggs," Emily breathed. "Where's Briggs?" "I don't know," Mitchell whispered back, pulling the drive free from the terminal and pocketing it in one swift motion. "We need to move, now." They slipped from behind the counter into the darkened hallway, moving low and fast, and Emily's pulse hammered against her ribs as a beam of light swept across the far wall, close enough that she pulled Mitchell sharply into a side alcove. Both of them pressed flat against the wall as footsteps passed within 10 feet of where they hid. "Basement level's clear," a voice murmured, low and professional. The kind of voice trained to sound calm even while conducting exactly the kind of operation it was conducting. "Moving to archive section." A second voice answered, further away, distorted slightly by a radio. "Confirm designation before you touch anything. Command wants the drive intact if it's still on site." Emily's stomach dropped. They already knew about the drive, which meant Briggs's 11-minute head start had bought them exactly enough time to find the truth, and exactly not enough time to escape with it cleanly. She glanced at Mitchell in the dark, and some silent shared calculation passed between them, the kind two professionals could exchange without a single word, the mutual understanding that they were now unmistakably out of options that didn't involve real danger. A shape passed the mouth of the alcove, close enough that Emily could have reached out and touched him, a rifle held low and ready in gloved hands, moving with the unmistakable precision of someone who'd done this kind of work many times before. She held her breath until he'd passed, until the sound of his footsteps had faded another 10 feet down the hallway, and only then did she let herself exhale, slow and silent. "Back exit," Mitchell mouthed, barely audible, gesturing toward a service door at the far end of the alcove, half hidden behind a stack of storage crates. They moved together, careful and controlled, every footstep placed with deliberate silence, and they were 3 feet from the door when a radio crackled somewhere behind them, far too close. "Movement in the east corridor. I've got 2 heat signatures near the service exit." Emily didn't wait for a translation. She grabbed Mitchell's arm and shoved the service door open, both of them bursting through into the gray light outside, sprinting across open ground toward the car with every ounce of speed either of them had left. Behind them, a shout rang out, sharp and urgent, followed almost immediately by the distinct gut-clenching crack of a suppressed shot, the round striking the doorframe inches from where Emily's head had been a half-second earlier. "Go, go, go!" Mitchell shouted, no longer bothering with silence, both of them tearing across the lot as more shots followed, none finding their mark, the two of them weaving low and fast, the way years of training had taught their bodies to move without conscious thought. They reached the car in a scramble of adrenaline and gravel, Mitchell throwing herself into the driver's seat, while Emily dove into the passenger side, twisting to fire 2 covering shots back toward the building the instant her door was shut, buying them the half-second Mitchell needed to get the engine roaring to life. The car lurched forward, tires screaming, as 2 more suppressed rounds cracked against the rear windshield, spiderwebbing the glass, but failing to punch through. Mitchell cut the wheel hard onto the access road, flooring the accelerator, and within seconds the annex was shrinking behind them, chaos and shouting fading into the growing distance. For nearly a full minute, neither of them spoke, both breathing hard, adrenaline still hammering through their veins, the reality of what had just happened settling in slow, jagged pieces. "They knew we were there before we even walked in," Emily finally said, her voice unsteady in a way she hated. "Sarah, that wasn't a response to us pulling files. That was already in motion." "I know," Mitchell said grimly, eyes locked on the road, knuckles white against the wheel. "Which means Whitfield didn't just find out we were coming. Somebody told him exactly where we'd be and exactly when." The implications settled over both of them like a physical weight, and Emily felt something cold twist through her chest that had nothing to do with the gunfire they'd just escaped. "Briggs," she said quietly. "You think he called it in?" "I think," Mitchell said carefully, "that a man who works in that building for 11 years learns exactly how careful he has to be about who he trusts and when. I don't know if he called it in, or if he was made to, or if it was never him at all. What I do know is that somebody with access to both our movements and that facility's staffing knew precisely when to send a team, and that terrifies me a lot more than the shooting did." Emily said nothing for a long moment, staring out at the empty road unspooling ahead of them, her mind circling back again and again to the name that had resolved beneath that black bar. Colonel Grant Whitfield. A man calm enough to sit across a table from her 2 days ago and lie to her face without a flicker of hesitation. "There's something else," Mitchell said quietly, after several minutes of silence, reaching into her jacket and pulling out a folded printout she'd grabbed in the final chaotic seconds before they'd fled the terminal. I didn't get a chance to fully read it before the lights went out. I just grabbed what I could. Emily unfolded it with trembling hands, scanning the header, and felt the world tilt sideways beneath her for the second time that day. It was a personnel transfer record, dated 18 months earlier, bearing a name she hadn't allowed herself to say out loud in 2 years. Master Sergeant Daniel Cole. But it wasn't a death certificate. It wasn't a casualty report. It was a classified relocation authorization, approving transfer of an individual under a new operational designation to a facility whose name had been redacted entirely 16 months after the live fire accident that was supposed to have killed him. Emily stared at the date until the numbers blurred, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, disbelief and something far more dangerous, hope, sharp and unbearable, rising in her chest all at once. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice cracking around the edges. "This is dated 16 months after his death." Mitchell glanced over, and whatever she saw on Emily's face made her ease off the accelerator slightly, some instinct telling her this moment needed more care than the speed of their escape allowed. "Emily," she said carefully, "that could be an administrative error, a record that never got closed out properly. It happens more often than you'd think in a system this deliberately confusing." "Or," Emily said, her hands shaking now, the printout trembling between her fingers, "Daniel Cole never died in that live fire accident at all." Neither of them said anything for a long moment, the only sound the tires humming against asphalt and the distant fading wail of a siren somewhere behind them. And Emily sat there, holding a piece of paper that had just cracked open 2 years of grief she'd carefully built her entire sense of the world around, staring at a date that suggested the man she'd mourned, the man who had taught her everything about seeing what machines couldn't, might have been alive this entire time. Mitchell pulled the car into a rest stop nearly 40 miles down the highway, an anonymous stretch of gravel and vending machines that offered exactly the kind of nowhere in particular cover they needed. She killed the engine and turned to Emily, who still hadn't looked up from the printout in her hands, her thumb tracing the transfer date over and over like she could will it into making sense. "We need to think about this clearly," Mitchell said, her voice gentler than it had been all morning. "Not with hope, with evidence." "I know how to read a document, Sarah." Emily's voice cracked despite her best effort to hold it steady. "This is a relocation authorization, 16 months after his funeral, 16 months after I stood in a cemetery in Ohio and watched them fold a flag for his mother. I'm not saying it isn't real," Mitchell said carefully. "I'm saying we don't know what it means yet. Relocation could mean 100 things. It could mean his remains were moved. It could mean an administrative record that never got closed. You already told me that once." Emily looked up now, and there was something fierce and raw in her eyes that stopped Mitchell mid-sentence. "You don't believe that any more than I do. Not after everything we just found. Not after a program that admits, in writing, that it wanted a controlled failure to look real. Sarah, what if Daniel found the same thing I'm looking at right now? What if that's why the live fire accident happened at all? And what if it happened exactly the way this entire operation seems to work? Not to kill him, but to disappear him somewhere nobody would ever think to look?" Mitchell didn't answer right away. She turned the idea over slowly, and Emily could see her methodical mind running through every angle, testing it against everything they now knew about Whitfield, about Prometheus, about a program willing to sacrifice a general's safety to prove a point. "If that's true," Mitchell finally said, "then Daniel Cole isn't just a dead man from your past, Sergeant. He's a loose end somebody's been keeping alive because they need him for something. And loose ends kept alive that long don't usually stay that way once they've served their purpose." The words landed like a fist to Emily's chest. "Then we need to find him, now, before whoever's protecting this decides he's outlived his usefulness." "We don't even know where to start looking." "We start," Emily said, forcing her voice into something colder and more controlled than the storm raging beneath it, "with the redacted facility on that transfer order. You said your CID access could dig through Sentinel's operational logs. It can dig through a facility designation too." Mitchell was already reaching for her laptop, but before she could open it, her phone buzzed sharply against the dashboard, and both of them went still at the sight of the caller ID. Unknown number. Same as the call that had come through days earlier, warning Emily not to have fired. Mitchell hesitated only a second before answering, putting it on speaker, her eyes locked on Emily's. "This is Mitchell." There was a pause on the line, a faint sound of breathing, and then a man's voice, low and measured, carrying the unmistakable weight of someone used to being obeyed. "Agent Mitchell, Sergeant Carter, I trust you're both recovering well from your morning." Emily's stomach turned to ice. She recognized the voice instantly, even distorted slightly through the phone's speaker. Whitfield. "Colonel," she said, keeping her voice flat, despite the fury coiling tight in her chest. "You've got some nerve calling us after your men opened fire on us an hour ago." "My men," Whitfield said, almost amused, "were dispatched to secure sensitive government property that you accessed without proper authorization, Sergeant. I'd remind you that breaking into a sealed archive and extracting classified files is itself a serious offense, whatever justification you've constructed for yourself." "Justification," Mitchell cut in sharply. "You mean the memo proving you authorized a controlled failure event that nearly got a 2-star general killed?" Silence stretched on the line, just long enough to confirm everything neither of them had needed confirming. "I don't know what document you believe you've found," Whitfield said finally, his tone unchanged, chillingly calm. "But I'd think very carefully before you go public with speculation you can't fully verify. Careers have ended over less. Lives have ended over less." "Is that a threat, Colonel?" Emily asked. "It's a courtesy, Sergeant, one I extend because General Harrison speaks highly of you, and frankly, I'd rather this resolve quietly than escalate into something neither of us can walk back." A pause, and when he spoke again, his voice had shifted, softer, almost intimate in a way that made Emily's skin crawl. "You've been asking questions about an old friend, Daniel Cole." Emily's breath caught. "What do you know about Daniel Cole?" "I know that some questions, once asked, can't be unasked," Whitfield said, "and I know that the answers rarely bring the comfort people imagine they will. Walk away from this now, both of you, and I promise you'll be permitted to go on with your lives. Continue, and I can no longer guarantee the safety of anyone connected to this inquiry, including Master Sergeant Cole, wherever he currently is." The line went dead before either of them could respond. Emily sat frozen for a long moment, staring at the phone, her pulse roaring in her ears. "He's alive," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "Sarah, he just confirmed it. Whitfield just confirmed Daniel's alive." "He also just told us he's willing to make sure that stops being true," Mitchell said grimly, already typing furiously on her laptop. "We don't have the luxury of being careful anymore. Every hour we wait is an hour Whitfield has to make this problem disappear, permanently." The redacted facility designation took Mitchell nearly 2 hours to crack, working through layers of encrypted routing with a focus so total she barely spoke, occasionally muttering to herself as she chased false leads down one dead end after another. Emily sat beside her the entire time, watching the road behind them through the side mirror, her sidearm resting within reach on her lap. Every muscle in her body wound tight with a mixture of dread and something dangerously close to hope. "Got it," Mitchell finally said, exhaling hard. "Facility designation Ironwood, classified research annex, officially decommissioned 11 months ago. Except," she scrolled further, her frown deepening, "power consumption records show consistent activity through last week. Somebody's still running that building." "Where is it?" 210 miles from here, middle of nowhere, southern Nevada, inside a restricted military testing range. Mitchell looked up at her. "Emily, that's not a place we can just walk into. That's inside an active exclusion zone. If Cole is being held there, getting to him means getting past security clearance neither of us has, past checkpoints that will flag exactly who we are the moment we approach." "Then we need help we don't currently have," Emily said, her mind already racing through the very short list of people she trusted enough to bring into something this dangerous. "Who?" Emily was quiet for a moment, turning the decision over, weighing the risk against the desperation clawing at her chest. "General Harrison," she finally said. Mitchell's eyebrows rose. "The man's still recovering from a gunshot wound, Sergeant." The man's also the only person with enough rank and enough personal stake in this to move faster than Whitfield can bury it, Emily said. He testified against full AI autonomy twice in front of an oversight committee. That memo names him specifically as the target selected to prove the opposite. If anyone in this entire chain of command has both the motive and the authority to help us, it's him. And if he's compromised too? Emily met her eyes steadily. Then we're already dead either way, and I'd rather find that out now than keep pretending we have time to be cautious. They reached the hospital just after nightfall, a private military medical facility 2 hours from the base, General Harrison recovering in a guarded wing that Mitchell's credentials, remarkably, still opened without incident. He was sitting up in bed when they entered, his shoulder heavily bandaged beneath his gown, a laptop balanced on his knees, and the moment he saw Emily's face, something in his own expression sharpened immediately. "Sergeant Carter," he said, setting the laptop aside. "I was told you were on leave. This doesn't look like leave." "Sir, I need 10 minutes of your time, and I need you to trust me without asking why until I've finished explaining." Harrison studied her for a long moment, then glanced at Mitchell standing beside her, taking in the tension radiating off both of them. "Close the door," he said quietly. Emily told him everything. The altered mission route, the override command locking Sentinel's coverage of the ridge, the Prometheus memo, its clinical language proposing a controlled failure event using a high-value asset, Whitfield's name resolving beneath a redacted signature, the phone call, the threat, the confirmation that Daniel Cole was alive somewhere inside a facility that officially didn't exist anymore. By the time she finished, Harrison's face had gone pale in a way that had nothing to do with blood loss, his good hand curled into a tight fist against the blanket. "They wanted me to almost die," he said slowly, like he was testing the shape of the words, "to prove that human oversight is the weak link in the system." "Yes, sir." "And they very nearly succeeded, if not for you disobeying a direct order that would have gotten me killed." Harrison's jaw tightened, something cold and furious settling behind his eyes. "I've spent 2 years telling that committee that no algorithm should ever be given lethal authority without a human being answerable for that decision. I told them exactly this kind of scenario was inevitable if we kept pushing autonomy without accountability, and they turned my own convictions into a target on my back." "Sir," Mitchell said carefully, "we need help reaching Ironwood facility. We believe Master Sergeant Cole is being held there, and Colonel Whitfield made it clear tonight that his continued survival depends on how quickly this investigation stops." Harrison was already reaching for his phone, wincing against the movement in his shoulder. "I have a direct line to the Inspector General's office that Whitfield doesn't know exists, because I opened it 18 months ago when I first started suspecting people around this program weren't being entirely honest with the Oversight Committee." He began dialing, then paused, looking at Emily with something that had shifted from gratitude into fierce, determined resolve. "Sergeant, you understand that once I make this call, there's no controlling how fast or how loud this becomes. Whitfield will know within the hour that we're moving against him directly." "He already knows we're moving, sir," Emily said. "The only question left is whether we move faster than he can cover his tracks." Harrison held her gaze a moment longer, then nodded once and pressed the phone to his ear. What followed was the longest 6 hours of Emily's life, coordinating in careful, urgent whispers between Harrison's hospital room and a growing web of officials Harrison trusted enough to loop in one by one. A 2-star general's authority proving, even from a hospital bed, more than sufficient to set wheels turning that Whitfield's rank alone couldn't stop. By early morning, an Inspector General's tactical response team, backed by federal warrants secured on an emergency basis through evidence Mitchell had pulled from the archive, was staged and ready to move on Ironwood facility. Emily insisted on going with them, and after a brief, tense argument with the response team's commanding officer, Harrison's direct intervention secured her a place in the convoy. "You found this," Harrison told her quietly, before she left his hospital room. "You've earned the right to see it through." The drive to Ironwood took nearly 4 hours, the desert landscape growing more barren and remote with every passing mile, until finally the facility itself came into view. Low, gray, utterly unremarkable from the outside, the kind of building designed specifically to be forgotten by anyone who wasn't looking for it. The response team moved with brisk, practiced efficiency, breaching the perimeter checkpoint before the two bewildered guards on duty could do more than reach for their radios. Emily stayed close behind the lead unit, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, every second stretching unbearably as they cleared corridor after corridor, room after room, moving deeper into a building that felt colder and more sterile with every step. They found him in a lower-level holding wing, in a room that looked more like a hospital ward than a prison cell, monitored by two security personnel who surrendered the moment they saw the tactical team's numbers. Emily pushed past the response team the second she saw him through the small window in the door, her breath catching so hard it hurt. Daniel Cole looked older than she remembered, thinner, a gray pallor to his skin that spoke of months without real sunlight. But his eyes, when they found hers through the glass, held the exact same sharp, steady focus she remembered from every training session he'd ever run, every lesson he'd ever taught her about seeing what machines couldn't. "Emily?" His voice cracked with disbelief as the door opened and she rushed inside. "Emily, is that?" "It's me," she said, and the 2 years of grief she'd carried folded down into something too large for words, her voice breaking entirely as she reached him. "Daniel, I thought you were dead. I stood at your funeral. I watched them fold a flag for your mother." "I know," he said, and his own voice shook now, rough with an emotion he clearly hadn't allowed himself in a very long time. "I've spent every day since wondering if anyone would ever come looking, or if I'd just quietly disappear into a file nobody would ever open again." "What happened to you?" Emily asked, gripping his hand, still hardly able to believe he was real and warm and alive in front of her. Daniel's expression darkened, old fear surfacing behind his eyes. "I found the same thing you did, Emily. Prometheus. I was pulling procurement records for Task Force Meridian 18 months before you ever saw that memo, and I found evidence they'd been quietly running unauthorized field tests, manipulating targeting data on live missions to build a case for autonomous authority. I reported it up the chain, exactly the way I was supposed to." His jaw tightened. 3 days later, I was pulled from a live fire exercise for what they called a routine equipment check. When I came back, they told me there'd been an accident, that I hadn't survived it, and then I woke up in a facility with no name, told that as far as the world was concerned, I no longer existed, and that my continued good health depended entirely on my continued silence. "They kept you alive as leverage," Mitchell said quietly from the doorway, having followed Emily inside. "In case they ever needed proof the program worked exactly the way they wanted it to, without a body they'd have to explain. Or in case they needed someone to blame if it ever came apart," Daniel said grimly. "A convenient scapegoat who is already legally dead. Nobody questions accusations made against a ghost." Emily felt fury rise in her chest, sharp and consuming, thinking of 2 years spent grieving a lie. 2 years Daniel had spent locked away as a bargaining chip for men who'd calculated his life was worth more as leverage than as a person. "It's over now," she said, though even as she said it, some cautious part of her mind refused to fully believe the danger had passed. "Whitfield's exposed. Harrison's already got federal investigators moving. This is finished." Daniel's expression, though, didn't soften the way she expected. If anything, it grew more urgent. "Emily, listen to me. Whitfield isn't the top of this. He's a colonel with expensive taste and enough guilt in his past to make him useful, but he doesn't have the authority to fund something at the scale of Prometheus alone. There's someone above him, someone who's been protecting this program since before Task Force Meridian ever got close to it." Emily's chest tightened. "Do you know who?" Daniel hesitated, glancing toward the door, an old, ingrained caution still gripping him even now. "I have a name," he said quietly. "I was never able to confirm it before they took me, but it's someone with enough reach to make an entire task force disappear, and enough patience to keep a program like this alive for years without anyone outside a very small circle ever knowing it existed." Before he could say more, one of the tactical team members appeared at the doorway, urgency written across his face. "Agent Mitchell, Sergeant Carter, you need to see this now." They followed him down the corridor to a small operations room, where a bank of monitors displayed security footage still streaming from cameras throughout the facility. On one screen, time-stamped from just 11 minutes earlier, was footage of a black SUV departing the facility's rear entrance at high speed, moments before the response team had even breached the front gate. "Who authorized that departure?" Mitchell demanded. The tactical officer's face was grim. According to the exit log, that vehicle was cleared by Colonel Whitfield's office 40 minutes before we arrived. Somebody warned him we were coming, and he got someone out of here before we could reach them. "Who?" Emily asked, though dread was already pooling cold and heavy in her stomach. The officer pulled up the facility's personnel manifest, scrolling to a name that had been checked out just before the vehicle's departure, and Emily felt the floor drop away beneath her entirely as she read it. It wasn't a prisoner's name, it was a staff designation, Program Director, Ironwood Facility, and beside it, a name that meant nothing to Emily, but made Daniel go rigid beside her, his face draining of what little color it had regained in the last 10 minutes. "That's him," Daniel said quietly, staring at the screen like he was looking at something he'd hoped never to see again. "That's the name I was trying to tell you. Dr. Marcus Holloway. He's not a soldier, Emily. He's the architect of the entire program, the man who designed Sentinel's targeting algorithms from the ground up. And if he just left this facility 40 minutes before we arrived, that means he's already 3 steps ahead of wherever we're standing right now." "Where would he go?" Mitchell asked, already reaching for her phone. Daniel's expression had gone hard and grim, a man staring down a fear he'd carried in silence for 2 years, finally forced into the open. Somewhere with enough resources to finish what Prometheus started, even without Whitfield to shield it. Somewhere he can either destroy every piece of evidence tying him to this before the investigation reaches him, or somewhere he can push the final phase of that program through before anyone has the authority to stop it. Emily's blood ran cold as a new and far more dangerous thought settled into place. The final phase. Sarah, the memo. It wasn't just about proving human oversight fails. It was about accelerating full authority transfer. If Holloway's about to lose everything, what does a man like that do when he's cornered? Mitchell's face had gone pale, already dialing, already moving toward the door. He pushes the button before anyone can stop him. The room seemed to tilt around Emily as the full weight of that landed, months of quiet manipulation and buried evidence collapsing suddenly into a single, urgent, ticking clock. Somewhere out there, a man with the power to grant an AI system unrestricted lethal authority was running, cornered, desperate, and utterly without anything left to lose. And the only people standing between him and whatever he intended to do next were exhausted, outgunned, and had less than an hour's head start to figure out exactly where he was going. Mitchell had the phone pressed to her ear before they even cleared the operations room, barking coordinates to whoever was on the other end, her voice tight with the kind of controlled urgency that came from understanding exactly how little time remained. Emily fell into step beside Daniel, who was still moving slowly, his body weakened by months of confinement, but his mind sharp and racing in a way that told her the old instincts hadn't dulled at all. "Where would Holloway run to push through a final authority transfer?" Emily asked him. "It can't just be a phone call. Something like that requires sign-off, doesn't it? Committees, oversight, paperwork." "Under normal circumstances, yes," Daniel said, his breathing labored but his voice steady. But Prometheus was never operating under normal circumstances. Holloway built in a contingency, Emily. I saw fragments of it in the files I found before they took me. An emergency authorization protocol meant to be triggered only in the event of, and I'm quoting the language here, catastrophic operational failure requiring immediate systemic correction. English, Daniel. "If Sentinel's credibility collapses publicly," Daniel said, "if this investigation goes public before Holloway can control the narrative, the protocol lets him bypass the committee entirely and push emergency authorization directly through the Undersecretary of Defense for acquisition, using a loophole written specifically for battlefield AI systems facing what they call operational compromise. If he frames what happened on that ridge as proof the system needs full autonomy immediately, rather than proof it failed, he doesn't need years of hearings, he needs one signature. Mitchell had lowered the phone, listening, her face pale. He's going to spin the ambush itself as the argument, not evidence against Sentinel, evidence for it. He's going to say a human being disobeying orders and taking an unauthorized shot is exactly the kind of unpredictable risk the system was designed to eliminate, Daniel said grimly. And if he gets that signature before Whitfield's arrest becomes public knowledge, before this memo becomes evidence in a formal inquiry, none of what we found will matter. Prometheus goes live. Full autonomous authority, no human in the loop, rolled out across every deployed unit within months. Emily felt something cold and furious settle deep in her chest. Where does he need to be to get that signature? There's only one place fast enough, Daniel said. A closed-door acquisition briefing. It would need to be scheduled already, something innocuous on the books that he can hijack. Emily, if I know Holloway, and God help me I do, he's been sitting on that contingency for months, waiting for exactly the crisis he needed to justify using it. Mitchell was already dialing again, her voice sharp with barely restrained panic. General Harrison, I need you to tell me if there's an acquisition briefing scheduled in the next 24 hours involving the Defense Undersecretary's office. A pause, agonizingly long. Then her face changed, the color draining out of it entirely. When? She lowered the phone slowly, looking at Emily and Daniel with an expression that told them everything before she said a word. There's a closed briefing at the Pentagon in 6 hours, Mitchell said, scheduled 2 weeks ago, ostensibly to review quarterly AI defense contracts. Harrison says Holloway's name isn't even on the original attendee list. He doesn't need to be on a list, Daniel said. He needs 5 minutes alone with the undersecretary and a folder full of manufactured urgency. That's it. That's all it takes. 6 hours, Emily repeated, and something in her chest tightened into a hard, focused knot, every ounce of exhaustion from the last 3 days burning away under the sheer necessity of what came next. Sarah, how fast can we get to Washington? Not fast enough on a commercial flight, Mitchell said, already moving toward the door, phone pressed back to her ear. But General Harrison just discharged himself against medical advice 20 minutes ago, and he's arranging military transport as we speak. If we leave in the next 10 minutes, we make it with barely an hour to spare. The flight felt endless despite its speed, the roar of the engines swallowing most conversation, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts for the first time in days. She sat across from Daniel, who had fallen into an uneasy half-sleep despite everything, his body finally surrendering to exhaustion, his will had refused to acknowledge for months. She studied his face, older than she remembered, lined with things she suspected he'd never fully tell her, and felt a fierce, protective gratitude that he was simply there, breathing, real, no longer a name on a headstone she'd visited twice a year out of a grief she now understood had been built on a lie. Mitchell sat beside her, scrolling through the Prometheus files one final time, cross-referencing names, building the case that would need to be airtight the moment they landed. There's something you should know before we get there, Mitchell said quietly, not looking up from the screen. I pulled Holloway's full record while you were talking with Daniel. He's not just the architect of Sentinel's algorithms. He was the lead technical advisor on the original committee that dissolved Task Force Meridian 2 years ago. He signed off on the paperwork himself. Emily's jaw tightened. So he's been protecting this from the very beginning. He's been building this from the very beginning, Mitchell corrected. Whitfield's just the man who executed the field operations. Holloway is the one who designed the entire architecture, the algorithm, the override protocols, the contingency plan we're racing to stop right now. If we don't get to that briefing room in time, none of what we've uncovered will matter, because in 6 hours, he won't need to hide any of it anymore. It'll be legal. Emily closed her eyes, forcing her breathing to slow, forcing the fury and fear churning in her chest into something usable, something focused. She thought of the ridge, of the 15 minutes that had shrunk to 5, of a shadow shifting on rock that no machine had been able to see. She thought of Daniel Cole disappearing into a windowless room for 2 years because he'd asked the same questions she was asking now. She thought of General Harrison, lying wounded in a hospital bed, refusing to let his own recovery slow down, a fight he'd apparently been quietly waging for 18 months before any of them had known his name. "We're not going to let him get that signature," she said, opening her eyes, her voice steady now in a way it hadn't been since the ridge. "No," Mitchell agreed, "we're not." They landed with 50 minutes to spare, General Harrison waiting on the tarmac despite a sling still cradling his injured arm, flanked by 2 federal agents and a look on his face that Emily had never seen from him before. Not the calm authority of a briefing room, but something closer to controlled rage. "The Inspector General's office has opened a formal inquiry," he said without preamble, falling into step beside them as they crossed toward a waiting vehicle. "Whitfield's been detained for questioning, though he's lawyered up faster than I've ever seen anyone move in my life. That's not our problem right now. Holloway is." "We know," Emily said. "We need to get into that briefing room." "You won't get past the front door with the clearance either of you currently holds," Harrison said grimly, "which is why I've spent the last 2 hours calling in every favor I have left. The Undersecretary agreed to grant us 5 minutes before the briefing officially opens, on the condition that what we bring him actually justifies interrupting a scheduled acquisition review." "It justifies it," Mitchell said, holding up the drive containing the Prometheus files. "Sir, this is more than justification. This is a program that deliberately created a lethal blind spot to test whether losing you would accelerate autonomous weapons authority. If that doesn't stop a briefing, nothing will." Harrison's expression darkened further, old anger resurfacing beneath the composed exterior he'd clearly been holding together through sheer will. "Then let's go stop it." The Pentagon's corridors felt endless, a maze of identical hallways that Emily navigated on adrenaline alone, her pulse climbing with every passing minute, every glance at her watch confirming the shrinking window they had left. They reached the outer office of the briefing room with 11 minutes remaining, and the aide stationed at the door looked up with poorly concealed alarm at the sight of a general with his arm in a sling, flanked by a disheveled CID agent and a sniper still wearing dust from a facility raid 4 states away. "General Harrison, sir, the Undersecretary is finishing preparation. He asked that—" "He agreed to 5 minutes," Harrison said, cutting through the aide's protest with the flat, unquestionable authority of 30 years in uniform. "I intend to use every second of it." Inside, Undersecretary of Defense Diane Ferris sat at the head of a long conference table, reviewing notes with the brisk efficiency of someone whose schedule ran in 15-minute increments. And beside her, exactly where Daniel had predicted, sat a man Emily had never met, but recognized instantly from the personnel photo Mitchell had pulled hours earlier. Dr. Marcus Holloway, mid-50s, silver-haired, composed in a way that reminded Emily uncomfortably of Whitfield's practiced calm, a leather folder open in front of him already. Holloway's eyes flicked to the door the moment it opened, and Emily watched something flash across his face. Not surprise exactly, but the quick, calculating recognition of a man realizing his timeline had just been compressed. "General Harrison," Ferris said, standing, her professional composure only slightly disturbed by the unannounced entrance. "I wasn't told you'd be joining us. And who are—" "Madam Undersecretary, I need 5 minutes of your time before this briefing proceeds," Harrison said, already crossing the room. "And I need Dr. Holloway to remain exactly where he is while I speak." Holloway's expression smoothed into something carefully neutral. "General, with respect, I believe whatever concerns you're bringing might be better addressed through proper channels rather than—" "The proper channels," Mitchell interrupted, stepping forward and setting a printed folder on the table with a decisive motion, "led us to a facility called Ironwood, Dr. Holloway, where you were holding Master Sergeant Daniel Cole against his will for the last 2 years, after faking his death to cover up his discovery of exactly the program you're here to push through today." Silence dropped over the room like a physical weight. Ferris's eyes moved from Mitchell to Holloway, sharp and searching, and Emily watched the first genuine crack appear in his composure, a tightening around his eyes, a stillness in his hands that hadn't been there 30 seconds earlier. "That's a serious accusation, Agent," Holloway said, his voice carefully even. "One I'd think requires rather more than dramatic timing to substantiate." "We have the memo," Emily said, stepping forward, her voice steady despite the pounding of her own heart. Project Prometheus, Autonomous Lethal Authority Initiative, Phase 2 Field Validation. Your name is on the authorization chain. It describes in your own department's language a controlled failure event using a high-value asset to demonstrate the risk of human authorization delays. That high-value asset was General Harrison. That failure event was the ambush that put a bullet in his shoulder 4 days ago. Ferris's head turned sharply toward Holloway. Marcus, what is she talking about? Madam Undersecretary, this is exactly the kind of unsubstantiated— It's not unsubstantiated, Mitchell said, opening the folder and sliding it directly in front of Ferris. It's your own program's documentation, recovered from a sealed archive this morning, cross-referenced against personnel transfer records that place Master Sergeant Cole at Ironwood facility as of yesterday, and security footage showing Dr. Holloway personally authorizing Cole's emergency transport out of that facility 40 minutes before federal agents arrived to execute a search warrant. Ferris's eyes moved across the documents with growing horror, her professional composure fracturing more with every page. This says you proposed accelerating the autonomous authority transfer using a fabricated crisis narrative. Madam Undersecretary, I would strongly caution against drawing conclusions from documents whose provenance hasn't been properly— The provenance, Harrison said, his voice dropping into something low and dangerous, is a sergeant who disobeyed a direct order to save my life on that ridge, because a machine your program manipulated told my security detail there was no threat where a very real one was waiting. I have testified twice in front of oversight committees about exactly this kind of risk, Dr. Holloway, and you targeted me specifically because you needed my credibility destroyed to protect your funding. Holloway's mask finally slipped, something colder and more desperate surfacing beneath the composed exterior he'd maintained through every word of the confrontation. You don't understand what's at stake here, he said, his voice tightening. Do you have any idea how many lives autonomous targeting systems could save if we stopped hesitating every time a human being's instinct got in the way of a faster, more accurate decision? Sentinel's confidence rating exceeded 98% on that mission. 98%, and it still got second-guessed by one soldier with an outdated weapon and an unverifiable feeling. That feeling saved his life, Emily said, gesturing toward Harrison, her voice rising with a fury she no longer bothered to contain. Your system was wrong, Dr. Holloway, not because of a processing gap, because you deliberately overrode it to create a blind spot on that ridge, hours before the convoy ever left the base. You didn't build a system that failed by accident. You built a lie designed to convince people like her, she pointed at Ferris, that human judgment is the problem, when the truth is your program manufactured the exact failure you needed to make that argument. Ferris stood slowly, her expression hardening into something Emily recognized instantly, the same controlled fury Harrison had carried onto that tarmac an hour earlier. Dr. Holloway, is there any part of what these people are describing that isn't true? Holloway's jaw worked silently for a long moment, calculation flickering visibly behind his eyes, weighing denial against the mounting weight of evidence spread across the table in front of him. I built something that could save countless lives, he finally said, his voice low, almost pleading now, stripped of the composed authority he'd walked in with. The old system, human authorization chains, hesitation, doubt, it costs lives every single day, in every deployment all over the world. I needed proof compelling enough that nobody could argue against it any longer. I never intended for General Harrison to actually die. The parameters were calculated to allow survival in the overwhelming majority of outcomes. You gambled a man's life, Emily said, disbelief and rage tangled together in her voice, on a statistical model to win an argument about funding. I gambled his life to save thousands of others down the line, Holloway shot back, some desperate conviction surfacing beneath the collapse of his composure. You don't understand the scale of what's coming, Sergeant. Warfare is changing faster than any of you are prepared to accept, and clinging to instinct and human judgment in an era of machine precision is going to get an entire generation of soldiers killed. I did what needed to be done. You had a man locked away for 2 years because he found out what you were doing, Mitchell said coldly. You erased his identity, faked his death, and kept him alive only because you might need him someday as either proof or scapegoat. That's not saving lives, Dr. Holloway. That's murder you didn't quite have the nerve to finish. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Ferris looked at Holloway for a long moment, something final and unforgiving settling into her expression, then turned to the two federal agents who had followed Harrison's party into the room, standing quietly near the door through the entire exchange. "Dr. Holloway is to be detained immediately," she said, her voice flat and absolute. "This briefing is canceled. Every contract associated with Project Prometheus is suspended, effective this moment, pending full federal investigation." She looked at Harrison, something almost like an apology in her expression. "General, I owe you and your team a considerably longer conversation than 5 minutes. But right now, get this documented and get it into the hands of people who can make sure it never happens again." Holloway didn't resist as the agents moved toward him, though his eyes found Emily one last time before they led him from the room, something cold and unrepentant still burning behind them. "You saved one general, Sergeant," he said quietly, almost too quiet for anyone else to hear. "You think that changes anything? Somebody else will finish what I started. The future doesn't wait for people who are afraid of it." Emily held his gaze, steady and unflinching. "Maybe, but it won't be you who builds it. And it won't happen because a man was willing to let good people die to prove a point." They let him out without another word, and the room exhaled all at once, the tension that had gripped every person inside it finally beginning to loosen. The investigation that followed moved with a speed Emily hadn't dared hope for, federal agents descending on records and facilities across 3 states within days. The Prometheus program dismantled piece by piece as evidence Mitchell had risked her life to recover became the backbone of a case too thorough to bury. Colonel Whitfield's carefully constructed defense collapsed within a week once prosecutors laid out the full authorization chain connecting him directly to the override command on Sentinel's targeting system, and the altered convoy route that had put General Harrison directly in a killer's crosshairs. He was formally charged, his career and freedom both ending in the same quiet, humiliating collapse that had once seemed impossible for a man who'd sat across a table from Emily with such untouchable calm. Dr. Marcus Holloway faced considerably more serious charges. The full scope of Project Prometheus laid bare in testimony that stretched across weeks of closed hearings, testimony that Daniel Cole, finally free and finally believed, gave without a single flicker of the fear that had kept him silent for 2 years inside a room with no name. Emily sat beside him during most of those hearings, watching him slowly reclaim a life he'd been told no longer existed, watching color and strength return to a man who had once taught her everything she knew about seeing what machines couldn't. His mother, who had buried an empty casket 2 years earlier, wept for an entirely different reason, the day she saw her son walk through her front door. And Emily stood a respectful distance away during that reunion, understanding it wasn't hers to witness up close, only grateful beyond words that it was happening at all. 4 months later, Emily Carter stood in a formal reception hall in Washington, D.C., her dress uniform crisp, her old rifle resting in a place of honor on a display stand near the entrance, cleaned and cared for, the same way it had been every day of her career. The room was full of people who had once dismissed her as an outdated relic clinging to a job machines had supposedly outgrown. Officers, officials, a few reporters who'd spent the last 4 months turning her name into a story that had traveled far beyond anything she'd expected. General Harrison approached her near the center of the room, his shoulder fully healed now, his handshake as firm as it had been the first day she'd met him, though everything about how he looked at her now had changed entirely. "Sergeant Carter," he said, "I believe there are quite a few people here who'd like a moment of your time." "With respect, sir, I've never much cared for rooms like this." Harrison smiled, something warm and genuine breaking through the composed authority he usually carried. "Neither have I, if I'm honest, but some rooms matter anyway." He gestured toward the small crowd gathering near the podium at the front. "They're about to formally announce the results of the Oversight Committee's review. Full moratorium on autonomous lethal authority pending mandatory human oversight requirements, written into law this time. Not just policy that can be quietly walked back the next time someone convinces themselves the ends justify it. Because of what happened on that ridge," Emily said quietly. Because of what you did on that ridge, Harrison corrected. There's a difference, Sergeant, and I intend to make sure everyone in this room understands it before tonight is over. He was true to his word. When the ceremony began, Harrison stood at the podium and told the story plainly, without embellishment, describing a soldier the entire command structure had dismissed as obsolete, a rifle everyone assumed belonged in a museum, and a decision that had defied a direct order because trusting a screen over a lifetime of trained instinct had never once made sense to the woman holding it. They said machines see farther than we do, Harrison told the room, his voice carrying easily across the silence that had fallen over every face turned toward him. They said machines calculate faster, react quicker, remove the danger of human hesitation. And on paper, in a boardroom, surrounded by projections and confidence ratings, that argument sounds almost impossible to refute. He paused, glancing toward Emily standing near the back of the room. But I am standing here today, alive, because one soldier refused to accept a number on a screen over what her own eyes were telling her. Because she disobeyed an order I gave, an order that would have gotten me and several members of my detail killed. And she did it because 5 years of training had taught her something no algorithm has ever learned: how to recognize danger that doesn't want to be seen. He looked out across the room, and something in his voice deepened, carrying the full weight of everything the last 4 months had cost and uncovered. We nearly built a future where soldiers like Sergeant Carter would never get the chance to make that call, where a machine's confidence rating would be the only voice in the room, and human judgment would be treated as a liability to be engineered away. I have spent 4 months learning exactly how close we came to that future, and exactly how many people were willing to sacrifice good men and women to build it faster. His gaze found Emily's again, and this time it held. Technology will always have a place on the battlefield. I believe that as strongly as I ever have. But it will never replace the person standing behind it, the one who dares to ask questions when everyone else has already accepted the answer, who dares to see the truth when the world would rather look away, and who dares to pull the trigger when every system in the world is still waiting for permission. The applause that followed felt distant to Emily, almost unreal, washing over her while her mind drifted back to a ridge in Arizona, to 15 minutes that had shrunk to 5, to a shadow that shouldn't have been there, and the 60 impossible seconds that had followed. She thought of Daniel Cole, alive and free, standing somewhere in that same room tonight, finally able to walk into a room like this without hiding. She thought of Sarah Mitchell, who had risked everything on nothing but instinct, and a hunch that something didn't add up. She thought of a young corporal named Ray Daniels, who had found the courage to tell the truth even with a bruise darkening his jaw, and of Whitfield's cold, calculated voice promising consequences that had ultimately landed on no one but himself. After the ceremony, Emily found her way back to the display stand near the entrance, where her old rifle rested beneath soft lighting, scratched wood and worn steel that had outlasted every prediction anyone had ever made about its obsolescence. A young officer approached her hesitantly, the same kind of skepticism Emily remembered wearing on soldiers' faces the day she first arrived at that base, though this time it was tempered with something closer to genuine curiosity. "Sergeant Carter," the young woman said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. Everyone talks about the shot, the 400 meters, the crosswind, all of it. But that's not really what saved him, is it?" "Not really." Emily looked at her for a long moment, then let herself smile, quiet and tired and genuine, the first real smile she'd allowed herself in longer than she could remember. "No," she said. "What saved him was refusing to stop looking, even after everyone with more authority than me had already decided there was nothing there to see. The shot was just the last 5 seconds of something that started a long time before I ever pulled the trigger." The young officer nodded slowly, something in her expression shifting, the way understanding sometimes arrives all at once instead of gradually. "I think I want to learn how to do what you do, Sergeant, the real version, not just the shooting." Emily studied her for a moment, seeing something of her own younger self buried somewhere in that earnest, uncertain face, and felt a quiet, unexpected warmth settle into her chest. "Then the first thing you need to understand," she said, is that the most dangerous thing on any battlefield isn't the enemy you can see. It's convincing yourself that just because a system says something is safe, it actually is. Machines can process an extraordinary amount of information, more than any human ever could, but they can only tell you what they've been taught to look for. They will never replace the person willing to ask what if it's wrong, and willing to act on the answer even when nobody else is ready to believe them. The young officer absorbed that in silence, glancing once more at the worn rifle resting in its case, then back at Emily with something like resolve hardening behind her eyes. Outside, the Washington evening settled cool and quiet over the city, and Emily Carter stood for a long moment beneath a sky full of the same stars that had watched over a ridge in Arizona 4 months earlier, thinking of everything that single decision had unraveled. A hidden program built on manufactured failure, a friend brought back from a death that had never actually happened, a colonel and a doctor who had gambled human lives to prove that human lives no longer mattered as much as the machines meant to protect them. She thought of every soldier who would walk a dangerous road in the years ahead, protected now by a law that existed because she had refused to lower her rifle when every voice above her had told her to stand down. She thought of Daniel Cole, alive because she hadn't been willing to accept a story that didn't add up. And she understood, standing there with the weight of the last 4 months finally beginning to ease from her shoulders, that the truest kind of courage had never been about the perfect shot at 400 meters. It had always been about refusing to look away, no matter how many systems, how many men, how many comfortable lies insisted that she should. And because one soldier had refused, on one ordinary afternoon in the mountains, an entire truth that powerful men had spent years trying to bury was finally standing in the light, and it would never be buried again. A year passed before Emily let herself think of that night in Washington as anything more than the end of a nightmare. It took that long for the adrenaline to fully drain out of her bones, that long for her sleep to stop snapping open at 3 a.m, with her hand already reaching for a rifle that wasn't there. And it was somewhere in that long, quiet stretch of healing that she began to understand the deeper shape of what she'd actually lived through. Not just a conspiracy uncovered, not just a friend rescued from a room with no name, but something far older than Prometheus, far older than Sentinel, far older than any of the men who had tried to bury the truth about that ridge. She found herself thinking about it one evening at Daniel Cole's kitchen table, the two of them sharing coffee the way they used to before either of their lives had been torn apart and rebuilt, before headstones and hospital wards and hearing rooms had rewritten what either of them thought they understood about trust. Daniel looked healthier now, color back in his face, the sharpness in his eyes no longer edged with fear, though something in him had permanently changed, the way survival always leaves a mark that healing can soften but never fully erase. "You ever think about Stanislav Petrov?" Daniel asked her that night, turning his mug slowly between his hands. Emily shook her head. "Doesn't ring a bell." "Soviet officer, 1983. Daniel's voice took on the same careful, deliberate tone he used to use back when he was still teaching her how to read a battlefield instead of just shoot across one. Their early warning system picked up 5 incoming American nuclear missiles. Confirmed detection, high confidence, exactly the kind of alert that was supposed to trigger immediate retaliation. Petrov was the man sitting in that command bunker, the one who had to decide whether to report it up the chain as a real attack. What did he do? "He didn't report it," Daniel said. He looked at the data, and something about it didn't sit right with him. 5 missiles seemed too small a number for a real first strike. If the Americans were actually launching, he reasoned, they'd send everything, not 5. So he waited. He trusted a feeling the system couldn't explain, and it turned out the satellites had mistaken sunlight reflecting off clouds for missile launches. If he'd reported what the machine told him, if he'd simply trusted the confidence rating instead of his own judgment, the world we're sitting in right now might never have existed. Emily sat with that for a long moment, the weight of it settling somewhere deep in her chest. "Nobody talks about him." "Almost nobody," Daniel agreed. because the story of a man who refused to press a button isn't nearly as exciting as the story of a war that almost happened. But every single time in history that a catastrophe didn't happen because someone trusted their judgment over a system telling them otherwise, that's a story that mostly goes untold. We remember the disasters. We rarely remember the men and women who quietly stood in the way of one. That conversation stayed with Emily long after she left Daniel's kitchen that night, turning over in her mind the way certain truths do when they finally find the shape of words big enough to hold them. She began to see the pattern everywhere once she started looking for it, threaded through more of history than she'd ever taken the time to notice. A radar operator during the Cuban Missile Crisis, who hesitated just long enough before confirming a false alarm that could have started a nuclear war. A ship's captain who refused a direct order because the numbers on his instruments didn't match what his instincts were telling him about the weather closing in. Soldiers throughout centuries of warfare who had disobeyed exactly the kind of order that would have gotten good men killed because something in their gut refused to accept a plan that looked clean on paper but felt wrong on the ground. She began to understand that what had happened on that ridge in Arizona wasn't a new kind of story at all. It was one of the oldest stories human beings had ever told themselves, dressed up in new technology and new language, but built on the exact same ancient tension that had always existed between the tools people built to make their lives safer and the irreplaceable judgment of the people who had to live with the consequences of trusting those tools completely. She thought about the printing press once, standing in her kitchen doing dishes on an ordinary Tuesday evening, of all the strange places a thought like that could arrive. How for centuries scribes had insisted no invention could ever replace the discipline and devotion of a monk copying scripture by candlelight, and how they'd been wrong about that, and how the world had been better for the change, even while something real had been lost in it too. She thought about the assembly line, about how it had changed everything about how goods were made, and how many skilled hands had once poured a lifetime of craft into work a machine eventually learned to do faster. Every generation, she realized, faced some version of the same argument. The machine is faster. The system is more reliable. The old way is inefficient, sentimental, holding progress back. And every generation, if it was paying close enough attention, eventually learned the same hard lesson, that efficiency was never quite the same thing as wisdom, and that speed was never quite the same thing as truth. What made Prometheus different, what made it dangerous in a way the printing press or the assembly line had never been, was that this particular machine had been given the authority to decide who lived and who died, and the men who built it had convinced themselves that removing human hesitation from that decision was itself a form of progress. Emily understood now, standing at her sink with soap suds cooling on her hands, that this was the exact fault line running underneath everything that had happened to her. Not a debate about technology at all, but a much older and much more dangerous debate about who gets to be trusted with the terrible responsibility of judgment. A machine could calculate. It could process more variables in a fraction of a second than any human brain could hold in conscious thought. But calculation had never been the same thing as wisdom, and Emily had come to believe, in the quiet months following everything that happened, that wisdom was something that could only be forged the way steel was forged, through pressure, through consequence, through the accumulated weight of having been wrong before and having had to live with what that cost. She thought of her own 41 confirmed kills, a number she never spoke of easily, never wore as a badge of anything except the grim understanding that every one of those numbers represented a moment where she had been given the terrible authority to end a life and had carried the weight of that choice long after the moment itself had passed. A machine would never carry that weight. It would never wake up at 3 a.m. replaying a decision, never sit across a kitchen table from an old friend wondering aloud whether it had done the right thing, never feel the particular ache of understanding that even a justified choice leaves a mark on the person who made it. And Emily had come to believe, more firmly than she'd ever believed anything in her career, that this weight, this capacity to be permanently changed by the decisions we make, was not a flaw in human judgment. It was the very thing that made human judgment trustworthy in the first place. A system with nothing at stake could afford to be confident. A person who understood exactly what a wrong decision would cost them, who would carry that cost for the rest of their life, had every reason in the world to hesitate, to double-check, to ask one more question before pulling a trigger or signing an order. That hesitation, the very thing Holloway and Whitfield had tried to engineer out of the equation as an inefficiency, was in Emily's experience the single most important safeguard a dangerous decision could ever have. She raised this once, months later, during a quiet dinner with General Harrison, who had by then become something between a mentor and a friend, the kind of relationship neither of them could have predicted the day they'd first argued over a map in a briefing tent. "You ever wonder," Harrison asked her, swirling his glass thoughtfully, "why every civilization that's ever built a great weapon eventually had to relearn the same lesson about restraint?" "I've thought about it more in the last year than I ever expected to," Emily admitted. "I used to teach a course at the War College," Harrison said. "Military history mostly, and there's a pattern that runs through almost every era, if you know where to look for it. Someone builds something powerful enough to remove the human cost of a decision. Gunpowder, the machine gun, the atomic bomb, and now this. And in every single case, the first instinct is the same. If we can win faster, if we can win more decisively, if we can remove the messy, unpredictable variable of human judgment from the equation entirely, surely that's progress." He set his glass down slowly. And in every single case, humanity eventually had to relearn, usually the hard way, that removing the human cost of a decision doesn't make the decision safer. It just makes it easier to make badly. Emily thought of the memo again, of its clinical, bloodless language proposing a controlled failure event using a high-value asset, and understood exactly what Harrison meant. Holloway hadn't built a monster because he was evil, in any simple sense. He'd built it because he genuinely believed that removing hesitation from a life-or-death decision was a form of mercy, a way of saving more lives in the long run by sacrificing the inefficiency of human doubt. And that was, Emily had come to believe, the most dangerous kind of mistake a person could make. Not malice, but a conviction so total that it stopped questioning itself, a confidence so complete that it had no room left for the possibility of being wrong. The oldest lesson in every military history book Harrison had ever taught, he told her that evening, wasn't about weapons at all. It was about humility. Every great commander who had ever won a war they had no business winning had done so not because they trusted their tools completely, but because they understood the limits of those tools well enough to know exactly when to set them aside and trust something harder to measure. Every catastrophic defeat in history, on the other hand, could usually be traced back to the opposite mistake. A commander so certain of his intelligence reports, so confident in his superior technology, that he stopped listening to the quiet, nagging doubt of the men on the ground who could see what the maps couldn't show them. "You were that doubt," Harrison told her, "on that ridge. You were the thing standing between confidence and catastrophe. The same thing that stood in that gap in every war ever fought, whether anyone remembered to write it down afterward or not." Emily carried that conversation with her longer than almost anything else from that entire year, because it helped her finally understand something she'd been circling without quite landing on since the moment she pulled the trigger on that ridge. She hadn't defeated a machine that day. She hadn't proven that old methods were simply better than new ones, that a bolt-action rifle was somehow superior to a drone network, because that framing had always been too small for what had actually happened. What she had defended, without fully realizing it in the moment, was something much larger and much older. The basic, foundational principle that judgment exercised by someone who bears the weight of its consequences will always be more trustworthy than judgment exercised by something that bears no weight at all. It wasn't about rejecting technology. Emily had never believed that, not even in her angriest moments standing across from Whitfield's calm, practiced lies. Technology had its place, an enormous and valuable place, and she had no illusions about pretending the future could simply be held back by nostalgia for an older way of doing things. But she had come to believe, with a certainty she hadn't possessed before any of this began, that technology should always remain a tool in the hands of someone accountable, never a replacement for the person who has to live with what happens next. The moment a system was given authority without accountability, the moment convenience was allowed to outweigh conscience, history had shown again and again that the results were rarely the ones anyone had intended when they first built the thing. She thought, too, about Daniel Cole's 2 years in a room with no name, and understood that this was the same lesson wearing a different face. A system that could disappear a person entirely, erase their existence with nothing more than a signature and a classification stamp, was a system built by people who had convinced themselves that efficiency and control mattered more than the irreducible, inconvenient fact of another human being's life. Holloway hadn't seen Daniel Cole as a person by the time he'd locked him away. He'd seen him as a variable to be managed, a risk to be contained, exactly the same bloodless calculation that had turned General Harrison into a high-value asset whose survival odds could be plugged into a spreadsheet. And Emily understood, more clearly than she'd ever understood anything, that this was always how the worst chapters of history began. Not with someone deciding to be cruel, but with someone deciding that a person had become, for the sake of some larger goal, simply a number. The antidote to that, she had come to believe, was never going to be found in better technology, in smarter systems, in more sophisticated safeguards written into code. The antidote was people who refused to stop seeing each other as people, even when a system insisted it would be more efficient not to. It was a corporal named Ray Daniels, terrified and bruised, who told the truth anyway because his conscience wouldn't let him do otherwise. It was Sarah Mitchell, who risked her career and very nearly her life chasing a hunch that most agents would have dismissed as paranoia. It was General Harrison discharging himself from a hospital bed against every doctor's advice because some things mattered more than his own recovery. And it was, in the end, a single soldier on a mountainside who looked at a screen telling her everything was fine and trusted. Instead, the accumulated weight of everything her own eyes and years had taught her to see. Emily thought sometimes about the letter she'd received nearly a year after the ceremony in Washington from a young lieutenant she'd never met, deployed somewhere she couldn't name in a place far from home, describing a moment eerily similar to her own, a system flagging a route as clear, an instinct screaming otherwise, and this time, because of a law that hadn't existed the year before, a command structure that was legally required to listen to that instinct instead of overriding it. Nobody died on that route. The lieutenant would likely never know for certain whether the danger had been real or imagined, because the mission had been altered before anyone had the chance to find out the hard way. And that, Emily thought, reading that letter alone in her kitchen with tears she hadn't expected blurring the words on the page, was exactly what victory over something like Prometheus was always supposed to look like. Not a dramatic reckoning, not a headline, just a quiet, unremarkable moment where a person's judgment was trusted enough to change an outcome nobody would ever be able to prove needed changing at all. That, she had come to understand, was the true measure of what she and Daniel and Sarah and General Harrison had fought so hard to protect. Not a single dramatic shot across 400 meters of Arizona mountainside, however much that moment had come to define the story other people told about her. What mattered, what would go on mattering long after her name had faded from ceremonies and headlines, was the quiet principle now written into policy because of what they'd uncovered, that no algorithm, however confident, however expensive, however seemingly infallible, should ever be trusted with a decision that a human being would have to live the rest of their life having made. History, Emily had come to believe, did not remember its heroes because they were the loudest voices in the room, or the ones with the newest tools, or the ones who moved fastest toward the future everyone assured them was inevitable. History remembered, when it remembered rightly at all, the ones who paused, the ones who looked at overwhelming confidence and asked one more question anyway, the ones who understood that the willingness to doubt, to hesitate, to demand better proof before trusting a comfortable answer was not weakness at all, but the very foundation on which every civilization's hardest-won progress had actually been built. She kept the old rifle in her home now, mounted above a modest fireplace, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. The same worn wood and scratched steel that had once been called an antique by soldiers who assumed usefulness was measured only in how new a thing was. She would run her hand along the stock sometimes, in the quiet hours when the weight of everything she'd lived through settled heaviest on her chest. And she would think of Daniel Cole teaching her, all those years ago, that the most important skill a person could ever develop was not marksmanship at all, but the discipline to keep looking long after everyone else had already decided there was nothing left to see. And she understood now, with a clarity that had cost her more than she would ever fully explain to anyone who hadn't lived it beside her, that this discipline, the refusal to look away, the courage to trust what could not be measured, the willingness to bear the full weight of a hard decision rather than hand that weight to something that would never have to carry it, was not a relic of some outdated era at all. It was and would always remain the single most essential thing standing between civilization and its own worst instincts. That was the truth Emily Carter carried with her long after the ceremonies ended and the headlines faded, the truth she would spend the rest of her life quietly teaching to anyone willing to listen, and the truth that history, whether it chose to remember her name or not, would go on proving correct, generation after generation, for as long as human beings kept building tools powerful enough to tempt them into forgetting why judgment, conscience, and courage could never be replaced.